Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. How's everyone doing today? My name is Brittany Grant, and welcome to the Hill's inaugural Diversity Matters Summit. I am the Director of Business Development with the Hill, and it is great to see so many familiar faces in the audience this morning. You know, today is bound to be an exciting morning of conversation, so thank you again for joining us. America today is markedly more diverse than any other time in history. From the halls of Congress to boardrooms across the country, both the public and private sectors are beginning to reflect the diversity of our society. But despite the strides that have been made, still a number of barriers exist in society, politics, the classroom, the office, and the boardroom. Social, political, and corporate barriers continue to reinforce endemic inequalities. Today, we are pleased to be joined by our exciting lineup of speakers to test the proposition that without diversity, firms suffer, organizations stumble, and associations of many flounder. But before we get started, we have a few quick housekeeping notes. So in addition to all of you here at the museum, we are live streaming on thehill.com. So please keep your phones on silent throughout the program, but we do encourage you to engage in the conversation on social media. You can do that by following us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn at The Hill Events, and join the conversation using the hashtag #TheHillDiversityMatters. We're going to be taking questions during the program and are always eager for your participation, so please be on the lookout for members of our team with handheld mics. And finally, we're always looking to make our events more dynamic and are really keen on hearing how we can make our programs more dynamic. So I encourage you to take a few moments to provide your feedback on today's program. But before we hear from our exciting speakers, it's my pleasure to introduce our underwriter for today's program, Vanda Pharmaceuticals, for brief remarks. Please join me in welcoming on stage AJ Jones, Chief Corporate Affairs and Communications Officer with Vanda Pharmaceuticals. AJ, we are very grateful for your partnership and support, so thank you again, and the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everyone. I am AJ Jones, as was mentioned earlier, and I am here to represent Vanda Pharmaceuticals. For those of you who may or may not know, we are a global biotech firm, and we are actually based here in the DC area, but more importantly, we also have operations across the globe. Two of our drugs that we commercialize, one is called Hitlios, the other one's called Fanapt. But for today, for those of you all who rose early this morning, Hitlios is probably something that you're interested in because it deals with sleep-wake disorder. So for all intents and purposes, I'm excited to be here. We at Vanda recognize that the people who are sitting around the table are part and parcel to what we do and how we are being able to influence, if you will, the future of health, and more importantly, the greater protection of our society as a whole. We recognize that in order to be able to make sure we have the best and the brightest, that we have to think beyond just the natural catacombs of diversity and speak more differently and more openly, if you will, about how do we get the best, but more importantly, how do we get the most authentic conversations going around this issue. We are excited to be partnering with the Hill and more importantly, with all the staff and all of you in this discussion. We hope that as we move forward, that this will not just be a one-off conversation, or more importantly, something that is here today and subsides into the next issue or next conversation that arises. We are hoping that this becomes a catalyst, not only for what we need to do in our country, but more importantly, what we need to do in each and every conversation that we have. For at the end of the day, what we are to become is part and parcel to what we are to challenge. I'm reminded, if you will, by the great quote by James Baldwin, who said, "Not everything is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." With that being said, I want to thank you so much, and thank you for the honor to be able to be here today and be able to kick off this discussion, and I'm looking forward to a lively interaction. Have a wonderful evening, but more importantly, have a wonderful, wonderful day. Thank you so much again.
Thank you again, AJ. Our first speaker of the day has played many roles in his career. He's Jack Donaghy's loyal assistant, Jonathan, on 30 Rock. He's the voice of the title character, Sanjay, on Nickelodeon's Sanjay and Craig. He's the co-founder of an anti-bullying campaign called Act to Change. And now has turned author with a middle grade novel, The Best at It, a coming-of-age story of an Indian American boy navigating the tricky world of middle school in a small town in Indiana. Please join me in welcoming on stage actor, activist, and author Malik Pancholi. Joining Malik on stage is Steve Clements, the Hill's editor-at-large.
Here, I don't know. Here, have the entire couch. You want to lie down and
take a nap.
Come into my.
It's gonna be like therapy.
I'll be the therapist today, which is the theme of the book, right? So,
yeah, I really.
Hey, everybody.
So
good morning. Thanks for doing this. Yeah, come in. I love these couches. Except I think, and this is finally a couch long enough for me.
It's so yellow. I love it.
So, Malik, I want to acknowledge first of all, congratulations. This is the book cover. For the
what
best
did you
at
do
it.
to the book?
Malik Pancholi, my wonderful colleague Nahara Acharya wanted to have this book and to save this, but I had to read the book, and so I've been carrying it around. So I said, hold the book cover while I wait. And then, of course, I lost the book last night at dinner. And I'm 9 pages from finishing it. So I'm very irritated because it's got me all wrapped up in the sort of soap opera of this young man, Rahul. So my first question, are you Rahul?
You know, it's so funny. It's like the number one question I get asked. So
okay, then
just
let's
to
not
like,
ask that.
Well, no. I feel like people are probably interested, and hopefully when they read the book, people will be interested. So just to like fill people in, so the book is about a 12-year-old Indian American kid named Rahul Kapoor who's just beginning to realize that he might be gay. He's not sure, but he's certainly being bullied about it at school. And he has a lot of anxiety around both his cultural identity and his sexual identity, and it plays out for him with obsessive compulsive like behaviors. And one night his grandfather, who's like his favorite person in the whole world and who is one of my favorite characters in the book, Bai, which means older brother, he kind of sees this behavior, and he tells Rahul this story, and at the end of the story, Rahul feels like if he's just the best at something, all of his other problems will disappear. So he sets off on a mission with his best friend Chelsea to find this thing that he's going to be the best at and to prove to the world, essentially, that he's worthwhile. And so, yes, I think Rahul, there's so much of Rahul, so much of me in Rahul. He's definitely a fictional character, but I was that kid who sort of, I think, tried to do a million things and tried to prove myself in an effort to hide away from so many of the things that I didn't like about myself, and so many of the things that I think the world was sort of telling me were going to be problematic, which were my identity, which my identity's on multiple levels. So.
I love the book, and so congratulations. The part where it will move you to tears in part, various parts, but one of the things that was really caught me at the beginning, and it just showed me how powerful this was, a journey for a young person reading this, was the story of his grandmother. And so when Bai is talking about his future wife, having been in India, I guess a mathematician or a scientist,
she
basically.
Went to engineering school.
Yeah. And having been told by numerous people that, they didn't want that one who was the best in the class because she didn't, fit all this, and that she overcame this. So for those of you, this isn't like to be inside baseball, but I think that it was a very powerful vignette. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, I can. It's so funny because I have family down in DC, and so I was staying with my mom last night and my sister, and we were talking about this story because the grandmother is very much based on my mom. So I aged her up, which most women are like, yes, please age me up in the story you tell. I made her the grandmother. But my own mother was the first woman in her village in India to go to engineering, to go to America, and also to go to engineering school. And she encountered a lot of pushback for being a woman who wanted to go into the sciences at a time when women were supposed to get married and stay home and have kids, which, to be honest, I think that we've come so far culturally, but I would say that there's still a lot of biases around that. And when you look at, certainly at organizations, which I'm sure that people you have later on today will be able to speak about this far more intelligently than I will, but if you look at corporate structures, we see that there are a lot of women in the workplace, but at the higher and higher up you go, like there seems to be fewer and fewer women, and that's problematic. But in the book, the grandfather tells the story to Rahul about how his grandmother was the first woman to go to engineering college, and all the men in the school made her life really hard because they didn't want to have a woman in the class. but that when she was the best in her class, they had to respect her. And that's the story that Rahul leaves, being like, well, if I'm just the best at something, people will have to respect me. And the thing that I think is complicated, and hopefully I've allowed that nuance to be in the novel, is that we do need to strive to be the best, I think, and it's good to win. And proving ourselves is, I think, part of, moving ahead in whatever careers we're in, but it shouldn't be that's covering up who we are. Like, women shouldn't have to work harder to become CEOs than men have to. They shouldn't have to prove themselves. Rahul shouldn't have to be the best at something for kids to like him. He should be able to be himself and his authenticity and still be liked.
So when there was another moment in the book when I'm reading it, and it's an incredible story where you deal with bullying, you deal with identity, you deal with how friendships are formed and how they fall apart. And then I'm feeling like I really want everyone in Congress to read this book. I want the guy over in the White House to read this book.
The guy.
Because when you look at it and read it, it's really a story that also has a lot of relevance to adults, I think. And we deal with bullying. I mean, we're looking at bullying at schools and the impact, but there's also a hell of a lot of bullying that goes on, intimidation, harassment, and we see this playing out every day. And so I'm just wondering, are you interested in this being used as a greater comment beyond school kids?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In the world of publishing, they before the book comes out, they send out advance copies, and those advance copies go to adults. They don't go to kids. And so the book just came out 2 weeks ago, October 8th. So it's now getting into the hands of kids in a way that it wasn't before. But the immediate response, or the initial response rather, was from adults, and it was like incredible. I was getting calls from people that were like, a woman told me that her brother came out to her as an adult, and had she had this book in middle school, she would have known how to talk to him and known what he was going through. I'm doing an adult book club here back in DC, where a mom was like, I want all my friends to read this book, and will you come speak at a book club? And I think part of it is that this story about a kid struggling with his identity, we've seen it from certain perspectives, but we haven't seen it from the perspective of Rahul Kapoor, who happens to be a 12-year-old Indian American gay kid. I think most kids and most adults, honestly, struggle with feeling different and feeling like we need to fit in. I have certainly, in recent weeks, been at parties where I'm sitting in the corner being like, oh my gosh, I'm the weirdo in the room, or we all struggle with that. And I just think that having this unique perspective allows us a way in to talk about it. But yes, I do hope that adults read the book. I mean, I love middle grade novels. I love YA books, and I think part of it is that when we're like 12 or 13, we rub up against things in our lives that become the things that we rub up against for the rest of our lives in a way. These struggles come up that we're constantly having to find our way around. And so, yeah, I would love it if adults find a connection to the book.
You and I were just talking about our mutual friend Michael Urie, and you're going to be performing with him at the Helen Hayes Theater in Broadway after this is all done. And it also struck me, you come out of a profession, with 30 Rock, the various shows you've done, where you're surrounded by people. And we used to always think that was cool and glitzy, and you're a TV star and all of that. But we're learning, really through folks like Ronan Farrow and others, how creepy and how awful some of the backstories are in your world. Yeah. And I'm interested in, now that you're writing about sexual identity of young people and how really one of the characters, Brent, was trying to weaponize some of that knowledge. I'm interested in how you see your world and what we who are not part of that should be worried about, should know about.
Do you mean like the entertainment industry, like in particular? Yeah, it's so interesting because I feel like the world of the theater and sort of like the backstage life of so many shows there's such a camaraderie, and there's what we're doing, I think, requires an amount of vulnerability. And immediate intimacy too, especially if you're guest starring on a TV show and you have like a big emotional scene, the way it normally works is you walk onto set, you say a few hellos, you read the scene once with the other actor, then you read it again for the camera crew, and then you're basically filming it. And so you're building like emotional connections right away. And I think that with that, you're putting yourself in vulnerable situations, and certainly we've seen this play out where people take advantage of other people's vulnerabilities. And just to speak about like identity, it's so interesting because I think like actors, like we're so open in a way, and there's always been this dichotomy, especially for the LGBT community, of sort of being one person on set and being another person in public life. And we're seeing that change for sure, but I also feel like when we talk about openly gay actors, we can count them like, on maybe a hand or two. And I think the same thing, revolves around like, people say like, you read a book about diversity, there's increasing diversity on television. I'm like, yeah, let's talk about the TV shows that have a lead character of color. And again, it starts to become like a thing where the numbers are not reflective of the world we live in. So I think we could be doing better on so many levels. And like you said, like entertainment, like we're in a unique position because people watch TV. Do you guys watch TV? Yeah, people watch TV, and people, and we're emotionally connected to it. Like these people that we watch on TV are in our lives for a long period of time, and so there's a lot of, I think, power in the storytelling that we put out there.
You were a member of the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders during the Obama administration.
Yeah.
You, in a dramatic moment, resigned from that.
Yes.
Can you tell us why?
Yeah, so I served on this commission under Obama, and our terms technically went until September of 2017. Do I have that date right? So we could have stayed on in this commission under Trump. I think there were 20 commissioners, and I think 17 of us resigned, I believe was the number. Everybody had their own particular reasons. For me, my focus while I was on this commission was working on anti-bullying issues for the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. And part of the task of the commission was to increase access to federal programs. So we literally were supposed to go out and say, if you're being bullied, you should report it to the Department of Justice, and here's how the government can help you. It was sort of the job of the commission. And early on in the Trump administration, I talked, I think it's okay to say this, but I had a conversation with someone at Mayor de Blasio's office in New York about how we would like to partner with them on their Respect for All week in schools. And the pushback was that having this listed as a White House anti-bullying campaign didn't fit the kind of messaging that they wanted to put out for their Respect for All week. And so what became really clear to me is that this White House label, which had allowed us to do so much work in the past, was actually going to become a hindrance to continuing the work. And then, it's just like the optics around going to a Muslim American kid and saying, hey, if you're being bullied at school for your religion, you can come to a government agency. At the same time, the government was instating a Muslim ban. It just felt like completely disingenuous. So that was, for me, that was the...
that really takes me to the question, because I'm sure you're now beginning to meet moms and talk to kids, and you're probably going to hear stories where this made a real difference. But I worry, in a way, that what else needs to happen? So you've given... I think you wrote the book in a way because you said in that literature out there you didn't see yourself.
Yeah.
You didn't see the kind of young person that you were at that time. What is the responsibility that you think the rest of us have to fill in that space for the young kid who wasn't in the book, and to deal with those children that may have anxiety issues, that may be being bullied, that are having a hard time evolving in this climate?
Yeah, in the book, so there's a thing in middle grade literature where often the kid is left alone, like the parents are very absent, and it's all about the kid on this journey. And this is certainly Rahul's journey, and he has to find for himself who he's going to be. And he's a 12-year-old. We were talking about this earlier. I don't think he has it all figured out by the end. I think as an adult, we can be like, oh, you got to get to that thing. But he's a 12-year-old, and I wanted to honor that. But for me, I didn't want to write a book where the kid was just left out on his own to figure everything out. Like, he has allies. He has a best friend who stands by him. He's got this grandfather who, in a way, I think misinforms him and tells him the wrong lesson, trying to help him. And the grandfather, too, has to go on a journey to realize that you don't always have to be the best at something to be the best. There's a conversation around the obsessive-compulsive behaviors that he has with his dad, where I don't think the dad has all the language. It's like an awkward conversation. He comes up to Rahul's bedroom and sees that the bed is pulled away from the wall so that the outlet won't touch the bed skirt. And he goes to push it back in, and Rahul freaks out and is like, don't push the bed back, don't push the bed back. And they have this conversation. So I say all this to say that the conversation is what feels so important to me, that even if we don't know how to have it, even if it's going to be messy, even if we don't have all the words, that having that conversation is so important. And so part of doing a middle grade book, I'm in the middle of a massive book tour. I think I've been like in 9 cities in the last like 2.5 weeks. But part of that tour is going to middle schools. And so I'm literally like doing assemblies of like 700 kids or a little writer's workshop with 20 kids. And these kids are remarkable and they're really willing to open up. I say like the book's about a kid who feels different. Have any of you ever felt different? And like hands go up. And these, this one kid was like, I have alopecia, and kids make fun of me for having no hair. One kid was like, I have ADHD and I'm short. So this idea of like, right? So it's like this idea of like multiple identities somehow being owned by, we don't even know what their identity issues are. So I think just being open to talking to them about it is so important.
I want to go to all of you for a question or two in just a moment, but the last question I have is, there's another powerful part in the book where I think it's Chelsea and Rahul are talking, and Rahul is confessing that he not only has a crush on this young boy Justin, but he wants to be Justin.
Yeah,
he has dreams and fantasies about like getting longer arms or like becoming Justin. And Chelsea goes, but what's wrong with yourself? Why not be you? And it raises this question for me, because I think in there, as we're thinking about diversity and inclusion and what frames we should use, and are we trying to be something other than what we are, I'm interested, we're going to be here all morning talking about this subject. What do you think we can do better than most diversity and inclusion conferences or discussions do? What are the blind spots in this discussion? As I found that something that made me think differently, in that reading that part of your book and said, that's a very interesting insight, where you don't want people to be different than they are. We need to meet each other where we're at and find a way to embrace one another. But how do you think we can improve the kind of discussion we're having?
Well, so this idea where Rahul sees this guy that he finds attractive, who happens to be straight and white and more athletic than Rahul, but he also has this idea that if he was just Justin, his life would be easier. To be honest, it's definitely a way I move through the world as a young person, and also a part of myself that feels really vulnerable to reveal in the book, because I think it's like a little confusing, and I think that that in all that messiness is where the confusion for so many young gay men lies, because we have so much messaging that you have to be this person, and so we think it's hard to understand the feelings, and so a big part of the book was like creating language, I think, around feelings that feel confusing as a kid, because I had no idea, and because I had that mindset, I had told myself that I was actually straight for so long, that I just wanted to be like the straight guys, and that the attraction felt so confusing. So I would just say, I think in answer to your larger question about what are the blind spots, everything is so complicated. And I think part of the reason I took a risk of revealing something that feels really personal, even like the OCD behaviors, I have that, but I'm really good at hiding it. So very few people know about why I disappear in the other room to check the lock 3 times. That it's like, oh, I'll be right back. I'm really good at hiding it. But I felt like it was important to talk about, because there are other people who are struggling with it and could maybe benefit by seeing that story reflected back. So I would just say, in terms of the blind spots, that it's incumbent upon all of us to be a little risky and to share a little bit of stuff that might make us feel uncomfortable in an effort to improve the situation, and that we have to both be, I think, courageous about doing it, but also creating space in which other people can be courageous.
Thank you. Thank you. Neil, before any questions, comments from the floor? You all don't know the book yet. Tonight at 7 p.m., you're going to be at Politics and Prose.
Politics and Prose, on Connecticut Avenue. I think it's going to be a really, really fun event. I'll be signing books, obviously, but I'm doing it in conversation with Gautam Raghavan, who I worked with during my time at the White House, and he was President Obama's liaison to, amazingly, both the AAPI and LGBT communities. It's interesting that those.
Are you going to send a copy to President Obama?
Oh my gosh, thank you for the idea. See, this is how ideas happen. Thank you. Yes, I'm going to send, I'm actually just going to send this cover. I'm going to be like, you don't need the book.
I got to tell you, getting President Obama tweeting out, wow, read this book. You know, you don't have to do all these books.
Well, he's big on the lists now, right?
Yeah.
There's like the playlists and the summer reading list, and you know, hey. Thank you.
No, he tweeted out a book called Truth Decay. It's not Tooth Decay, but Truth Decay, and it's a wonky book about the collapse of reporting and whatnot. It's a Rand Corporation book written by a friend of mine there, and no one was ever going to buy this book. And then it became a bestseller from that way.
Oh my God.
Does your husband like the book?
Oh my gosh, he loves the book. The thing that I think he finds a little challenging.
Is he one of the characters in the book?
That's so funny. I think he would like to think that he's the Justin character because Justin's like the cool guy. Although I just have to throw out there that Justin ends up being not the coolest guy at the end, which I think is everyone's discovery. You know, we all have that moment where you look back and you're like, why did I ever feel that way about this person? They are so not cool. I was going to say that I think the thing that is, because I'm on this tour and because so much of tour is like going to cities where you actually know people, he's been like jetting around the country a lot with me. And I think he's like, all right, enough of the book already. No, he's super supportive.
And the bully in the book
loving.
is a guy named Brent.
Yeah.
I'm sure we all have had Brents. I certainly had Brents when I was growing up, and also dealing out with my own gay feelings at that time and was harassed in some ways. Did you ever reconcile with whoever your Brent was?
Not, you know, I didn't have I don't think I had like a particular Brent. Brent's sort of an amalgamation of like a couple different people. I feel like, this is going to sound terrible, but I feel like the reconciliation, honestly, is just about like feeling comfortable in myself, and then occasionally seeing some people on Facebook and being like, wow, your life didn't turn out so great. That's terrible. That is terrible. That's terrible to say. I love them all. I love them all.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say, read this book. This is really, really great. Let your kids read the book. I was reading it over the weekend, and I have a fantastic colleague at the Hill, Niharika Acharya, and I tweeted and I said, oh my God, you're Malik Pancholi's mom. Because the mom you describe in there is, and then Niharika writes, it says, all Indian moms are the same. But it's a fascinating journey into a lot of different worlds. Thank you so much for it, because it really made my weekend. The best at it, Malik Pancholi, congratulations. We look forward to seeing how it does. Thanks so much. And tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, or no, tonight 7 o'clock, Politics and Prose. If you want to have more and buy the book, we'll have it there. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Malik. So great to have you with us this morning, and congratulations again on your book. Next up, please join me in welcoming on stage Congressman Ben Ray Lujan, Assistant Speaker of the House of Representatives and the highest-ranking Hispanic in Congress. Steve will be staying back for this conversation. So, Steve, please take it away.
My team members. Okay. We're up. Congressman, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Nice to see you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Everybody.
Great to be with you. I don't know if you knew this. I worked for Jeff Bingaman in the 1990s. So I worked for the state of New Mexico for a long time. So good to see you here. Yes. I guess the thing I want to start out with is on this broad subject of diversity. How would you grade the U.S. Congress today?
Improving.
Improving. From what grade to what grade?
So, look, when you look at the ethnic and racial breakdown of members of Congress, this last election, it improved dramatically. But still, 90% of non-white members of Congress are on the Democratic side of the aisle. Only 10% on the Republican side of the aisle. So there's a lot of room for improvement. The Congressional Black Caucus has the most members it's ever had. The Congressional Hispanic Caucus has the most members that it's ever had. There's a record number of women serving in the U.S. House of Representatives. We had the first 2 Native American women elected to the Congress, the first 2 Muslim women elected to the Congress, the first 2 Latinas out of the state of Texas elected to the Congress, who are now serving with the first Democratic member elected, Lucille Roybal Allard, and the first Latina who recently retired, Ileana Ross Latenham. So it's hard for me to give it a grade. I would just say it's improving. There's room for improvement. And I'm very proud of the work that occurred in 2018. One of the things that I'm most proud of as I was elected by my colleagues in 2018 to chair the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and appointed by Speaker Pelosi in 2016. In 2018, we proved that candidates of color don't have to be elected from communities where they're the majority. When I was elected to Congress, and this may surprise a lot of people coming from New Mexico, my district's only 36% Hispanic. We need to break that mold where you're electing the best candidates across the country and you're identifying them and find them. And this last year, I think we proved that we can do it, that we should do it, and that you build an army that helps get the job done.
Now, I know in the DCCC there was some controversy over the staff and over about, whether or not we were living and walking the walk about whether we were hiring diverse staff, maintaining diverse staff, or just checking off boxes. How is that situation today?
Well, so I am very proud that when I was the chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, we had the most diverse staff that we had seen at the committee, whether it was staff in decision-making positions, part of the leadership, that were African American, Latino, women. The first woman ever to run the IE, I brought on board the first Hispanic to run the DCCC. I was honored to hire. And I will say that as we went through August, where under the current chair, there was a lot of listening that took place, and I believe that the committee is in a stronger place now. But again, one of the things that I did when I was the chair of a major party committee was I voluntarily released our diversity numbers. There's only one way to hold us all accountable. Release the numbers. And that way every year you don't have to debate, well, was it 2 or 3 last cycle? No, you just go to the numbers, go to the chart. And I think that if we continue to do that in Congress, with our campaign committees, Democrat and Republican, corporate America, if we're gonna ask everyone to do this, then we should be willing to do it ourselves. And that's why I made that decision to voluntarily release those numbers as well.
We're all getting wrapped up, as I knew you are, struggling with impeachment and the impeachment process, what's going on. I think there are votes that are potentially happening today, as I understand it. Thursday. And in this climate of the issues with the behavior and the actions of the President of the United States, part of what has fallen into this is the divide racially, the divide about Muslims. There's been a lot that's been building up that's been frustrating for at least I know many of the Democrats. What are the most significant things that you have in mind that the president has crossed red lines? Which red lines matter most?
Look, when a chant is able to be led and not stopped by our commander-in-chief, when people yell out, send them back where they came from, and then it turns into a chant. And that was directed at Ilhan, at Rashida, at Alexandria, and Ayana. It's one of those things that's said that it angers you so much that it's being said about your colleagues, about these 4 women, all U.S. representatives. But then it's incredible how the mind works. And it takes you back in time where I'm sure many people in the room had the same experience I'm about to describe, where someone told you to go back where you came from and that you're not welcome. And it hits a much deeper emotional response where, one, you know this is wrong and you're going to stand up against this. It should not be happening from our commander-in-chief, nor anyone for that matter. But then when it hits that really deep emotional place that maybe you tucked away, it helps us understand why there was such pushback from people from all corners of America and around the world. When President Trump, during his campaign, singled out a Latino in Judge Gonzalo Curiel and suggested that this federal judge, Hoosier, University of Indiana graduate, could not serve on the bench because his parents were Mexicanos. Because he was Mexican American. What's he saying to people like me? I should be a U.S. representative? I should go back where I came from? I'm not doing the question justice because we don't have enough time. But the conduct and the words that are being used by this administration are not just beneath our values in the United States of America. These are beneath human interaction. And we've still come a long way, but we've made such small steps that anytime something like this happens, it takes us back further than where we started the progress from. The words that he uses with who I'll call anti-Maxine, but Chairwoman Waters, Frederica Wilson, suggesting that they're not intelligent people. I mean, all of these words matter, and they tap into the race and the hate that continues to spread, all the way to policy decisions that have been made by this administration continuing to target the LGBTQ community, namely the transgender brothers and sisters that we have across America. That's what's concerning. So again, I don't know that I have enough time. We could probably write a book.
No, it's very powerful what you
this.
said, and I'm glad you brought the transgendered rights issue to the table, because at the end of the Obama administration, I had the privilege of interviewing a man named Eric Fanning. Eric was the gay Secretary of the Army, and he and his staff, along with Ash Carter, who was the Secretary of Defense, and others, secured the open rights and participation of transgendered service in the U.S. military. And I asked him whether he thought that would stand after Donald Trump's success, but Donald Trump hadn't been inaugurated yet. And Eric made the comment, it's really hung with me, kind of haunted me in a way. He says, rights are very hard to roll back. And I think that Eric was wrong, because we see clearly the rollback of transgendered rights in the military. And I wonder, you're a legislator, you have a co-equal branch of government, you're writing laws. I'm wondering whether or not there needs to be an enforcement dimension. What can we do, what can we see done to prevent the erosion of rights that had been previously secured for folks?
Well, one, the Congress cannot be silent on these issues. We need to be vocal. So when we talk about the attacks with transgender rights, the lack of support that we now have under Mitch McConnell and a Republican-led U.S. Senate, we passed the Equality Act out of the House. This is a non-controversial, no-brainer piece of legislation to adopt. And discrimination and hate, period. Take it up. So one, I believe that elections have consequences, and I'm not certain what more can be done until we see that shift in the U.S. Senate. But here's where I have some optimism from a party perspective going forward. Younger generations, these are not issues that divide us. Democrat, Republican, Independent, Libertarian, decline to state, whatever it may be. And that's why I have hope that younger generations, as we see our Republican Party get younger, that they will demand action. And they will stand up to the obstruction being caused by elected Republican leaders, as is the case with Mitch McConnell on the Equality Act. And we have to keep pushing this bar forward, all the way down to voting rights, to the point that rights may not be protected. The erosion of the enforcement actions pursuant to the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court, and a reluctance by our colleagues again in the U.S. Senate to take up provisions that we've adopted in the House to bring those provisions back, it should be very concerning to all of us. Why there would be policy to make it harder for people to vote, not easier for people to vote, is something that we should be asking. But when my colleagues can't win based on the maps that they have, they make it harder for people to vote, purge the rolls. There's actions that are taken to change the map, to change the rules. That's something that we all should not put up with. But again, the only place that we can take that forward, especially as it's coming forward at this point, given the current makeup, the House and Senate, the executive branch of government, is in November 2020.
One of my friends in the room here today is Xavier Polymerase. Xavier was the president of the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and he reminded me recently in a conversation that 32% of Hispanics voted for Donald Trump, and which is it's a much bigger number than he thought was coming, and he has shared the fact that a lot of people voted for President Trump out of the Hispanic community because they felt demeaned, or they felt like they felt that they were not embraced by the Democratic Party. They did not feel that they're. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that. Is it a healthy thing that a significant number of Hispanics voted for Donald Trump and identify with the Republican Party, or should there be? Is race and identity becoming a political divide that Democrats want to? I won't say monopolize, but oligopolize.
Mm-hmm. Well, one, I see Javier in the room.
Yeah.
And I respect.
Is that okay? Is that a fair recount of what you said?
Yeah.
Good.
And I respect Javier very much. In 2016, something happened, and it was to the Latino community, to the African American community, and to the Asian American Pacific Islander community. There was a repeat of previous elections where candidates show up after early voting has begun into a community, and you go and you say, okay, now it's time to vote. You need to go vote, and the polls have opened. But a conversation was not had with the communities for the previous 2 years. So when I became the chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, we're midterm, so it's not presidential, so you're the game. And especially in 2018, where the map favored us more than it favored Senate pickups for Democrats across the country. So we instituted something that I know to be true and that I do at home. You need to make sure you start talking to people earlier. And we made a decision with the team at the DCCC that you're going to go into communities, even if communities of color, even if they're only 1% of a congressional district. Because we knew that if we won some of these races, it would be like a few hundred votes, right? And all of a sudden, 1% of a community matters so very much. But the only way you're going to get people to show up and vote is if you go knock on their door, if you talk to them, if they open you up on their screen and they invite you into their home, whether it's electronically or they invite you in to have some coffee. We also did something to the Latino community that Javier has talked about before. We're not a monolithic community. You can't just have one ad with one dialect of Spanish talking about one issue. It turns out that in communities of color, education matters, job opportunities matter, health and environment and injustice, it all matters. We're mainstream Americans as well. But you also have to understand that, especially in the Latino community, that you're made up of a lot of families. So I'm not going to send someone from New Mexico unless they're Cuban born or Puerto Rican to go speak to my brothers and sisters down in Florida. And even then, I better have friends from South America, from Mexico, from Cuba, and from Puerto Rico, right, with my American brothers and sisters from the island to go speak to those people. Otherwise, they're not going to listen. And here's something else that I did. I grew up at a time, and some of us in the room will understand this. My parents were in high school and junior high like in the 50s and 60s. They were punished in school with a ruler. I see some head shaking. On the back of their hand, on the front of their hand, or on the back of their neck when they would speak Spanish. When they were first Spanish speakers, their parents and grandparents were Spanish speakers. And in the case of New Mexico, as I proclaimed to President Donald Trump when he was in our state a little more than a month ago and asked a journalist, who do you like more, our country or Hispanics? I'm an example of a family whose the lines moved on us. Right before the Mexican-American War, before the Gadsden Purchase, my family was living in what was old Mexico, that is now New Mexico. So 11 generations strong there.
Did you send the president a note, by the way, about the Colorado-New Mexico border?
I think Senator, Senator Wyden probably drew a better map than I probably could have put together with that being said. But we made sure that where I was getting at is, in New Mexico, I grew up speaking Spanglish, right? A little bit of English, a little bit of Spanish. Because when my parents were in the room, I couldn't talk to my grandparents in Spanish, but they talked to me in Spanish. So it was like English and Spanish. And so even today, those words sometimes will evade me when I'm speaking or doing interviews. So I use a little bit of Spanglish. We did ads in Spanglish to families across America where we knew that those communities also spoke in English and Spanish. And we also did Spanish language ads. In the African American communities, we listened to our colleagues in the same way that the Senate campaign did down with Doug Jones in Alabama. And we started reaching out to families with those church newspapers, with minority-owned, people of color-owned radio stations, television stations. Like, you know, it's not hard. But you got to put your money where your mouth is and show up and make sure you're talking to the communities, that you understand the diversity of the communities that we're trying to show we care about you. And we want to listen to you, we want to learn from you. And we're all better when we're together.
It's very powerful. I want to go to all of you in just a moment, but let me ask you one last question. It's taken me a while, but a lot of my, investigation and reading about America's legacy of investment, say in infrastructure or what we did in finance with home buying, there's a legacy of redlining, greenlining, or of whatever it is, discriminatory practices towards communities of color in this country. And the story is a bad one. I mean, it is where you go into cities and look at what freeway and highway decisions did to cut off communities. You go to Baltimore, where you've got 20-year life span discrepancies between different parts of greater Baltimore. And you look at the criminal justice system and you look at who's in jail and who's not when you look at that. And it's just an awful, awful picture. And again, from a legislative perspective, I know there's been some steps in criminal justice reform. In my book, they're pretty paltry. What do you think we need to do from an issue of fixing the lack of appreciation for the diversity of this country and the decisions that we've had in, bank financing and infrastructure investment decisions across the board? The reparations discussion is part of this discussion. What else do you think we need to do to rectify a lot of the wrongs in the past and begin getting on a better track?
Well,
in 2 minutes or less.
You follow the advice of Congressman John Lewis. You push and pull and you make some noise. You got to speak up. I mean, it's this notion of these injustices have continued to take place because good people have been silent, or good people's voices have not been amplified. The work that Cory Booker and Hakeem Jeffries did recently with justice reform, the attention that's finally being brought to communities where the smokestacks go up. I asked the previous, I don't know if he was acting secretary, or, Mr. Pruitt, when he was traveling around the country and around the world and we heard about the luxurious travel, asked him, how many communities of color or poor cities have you been to? Poor communities. Not a one. That's your job. And you look at the health disparities, the environmental injustice that takes place, how communities are divided up. Native American communities whose water systems were put in back in the 60s and 70s, investigations have now shown that they were using electrical conduit to drop in their water lines because they saved the company some money, pennies on the dollar. There's injustices like this that are taking place. If you see where the dollars go to help get access to safe drinking water, the poor families now, especially look at California, when the electricity was cut off. If you have some money, you could probably go find somewhere to stay. But what happens if you don't? What happens to all that food in your refrigerator that you fought so hard that's now going to go bad? How are you going to feed your kids? How are you going to feed your families? And we need to talk about these injustices and disparities as it impacts our communities and where the dollars have gone and where they have not gone. The divides with broadband access, internet access, starting your own business, the homework divide, where you see children in poor communities, children especially in communities of color, where they're having to go to the local fast food joint or the local public library and sit outside in the dark all night long to get their homework done, because most homework is done now depending on online curriculum. We've got to close that gap. If you're not going to give people a head start or even a chance, how do we expect them to succeed? And I think that those are many areas where there are example upon example of where we need to stand up, speak up, and get something done, and make sure the American people hold their elected officials accountable. It's you go put up ads and you talk about this stuff, you got to make sure that you're putting the policy to work and that you're checking those votes and you know whose side people are on. Those are the questions we need to be asking, holding people accountable.
Thank you. Let me open the floor to all of you. There's got to be a question now. Yes, in the very back, this gentleman.
That's Javier.
And did Javier put his hand up too? I knew you were going to. So we'll do these two real quick. Yes, sir.
Good morning. My name is David Morgan. I'm a president of an organization called the Multicultural Media Correspondents Association. And we're in the 4th year of a call to action to move the needle on diversity. I first want to applaud the Hill for having this discussion. I think this is incredible, and I had to be here. And Congressman, I want to thank you for coming and lending your weight and support to this issue and what you're doing on the issue. I'd also like to acknowledge that, as you know, some of your colleagues like Mr. Cardenas and Ms. Clark and Ms. Chu started caucuses on media diversity, and Ms. Demings actually authored a resolution, as you know, reaffirming Congress's commitment to media diversity. So I think this is all great. So my question is, what is your view on how we can better collaborate and amplify so that we can sort of make this a more mainstream, national, and make more people understand the importance and that we are facing a media diversity crisis?
Thank you so much.
Well, so when it comes to diversity, we need to tell those stories, and there's no better partner than media partners as well. Now, I understand that our journalists, you have a job to do as well, and sometimes members of Congress will evade or try to scoot around, whatever it may be. But we should seek each other out and tell those stories. When there's information to be shared, when there's questions to be asked, when journalists that are leading the diversity conversation are asking for time, we should make ourselves available as well. I think that's going to be critically important in all of this. When I was the task force chair in diversity for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus back in 2014 or 13 and 14, this was something that was real important to me as well in holding corporate America, even the Obama administration, members of Congress, nonprofits, advocacy organizations accountable. You have to ask those tough questions. And when we're in the room together, we should be asking those questions and be asking for the transparency so that it can be reported upon as well. And then we lift all boats together. I think that's something we can do. But I'd be interested in your thoughts and ideas. Let's get a chance to sit down and chat a little bit and see how we can bring more people to this table and to the discussion.
Xavier Polymerase.
Good morning. First of all, Steve, I see you're up to your old tricks of leading the discussion and really forcing us to deal with issues in a way that is very much like you've always been. So thank you for doing this. Secondly, Congressman, I have to tell you, first of all, I'm very biased. I'm a huge fan of you, the work you've done, the kind of American life that you've led, the service you provided to this country. So I'll begin there. Last night we talked about a wide array of issues, and one of them was this notion that we find ourselves today as a country, as a society, that when someone disagrees with you, particularly on the political side of things, we immediately kind of run to our corners, and the anarchy and the hatred is just pervasive. And this notion that somehow when someone believes something differently than we do, that we begin, and I'm guilty of this, that we begin to think of them as perhaps less American than I am. Because how could you not have the values that I've got? How could you possibly vote for that man or that ideology? How could you possibly back that perspective? I know that you've led from the front, and I want to thank you for your candor and your leadership on that front. But what do you suggest that we could do, and particularly you and your colleagues could do, to reach across the aisle to at least the handful of conservatives that still have a conscience, and try to work with them so that there's a little bit more kind of, an ability to work together as one Congress, not a divided Congress. It's a very difficult time, and we depend on people like you who have the strength and the track record to reach across the aisle and bring some of your colleagues on the other side to this side. Does that make sense? And,
yes, sir.
And what could you do for us?
Javier, we have to do what we're doing here. We have to talk to each other. Whether it's members of Congress to members of Congress or family member to family member. Holidays are around the corner. There's going to be families that are gathering. And you all know what conversations you all will proclaim that are out of bounds over that meal. We need to talk to each other. I still go back to some decisions that were made by Newt Gingrich, but that have not been corrected by Democratic leaders as well, including myself. When there was a decision made to shorten the work week in the halls of Congress and tell families they were going to go home as opposed to stay out here with members. When members were told that they were going to fly in on a Tuesday and go back to their districts on a Thursday. The conversations that typically took place on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday morning, which were with spouses, partners, and children over a ball game, if you're a person of faith, over a sermon, or maybe a meal where everyone would come together on Sunday afternoon. If you knew you had to face the family of those you were working with on a regular basis, you treated them with a little more respect and dignity because they were going to keep you in check. We need to find a way to bring that back, I think, to strengthen and to bring Congress back to a place where we're working together. And all of this was on full display this last week. The environment that's been established in our elections going into 2020, where it's WWF. You're either for the person wearing whatever the uniform is or the corner of the ring that they're in, or you're against them. And look, I didn't have any pride in the booing of the president this weekend. I have a lot of concern for the country when we have to investigate the commander-in-chief and consider one of the tools that were put in place by the founders of our young country to hold them accountable. Witnesses that are coming forward. Vietnam veteran, served our country, now in service to the State Department that is being discredited. A lieutenant colonel that's coming today, Purple Heart, Iraqi veteran, who is being decimated through one outlet in America. What have we come to? And so, Javier, your question matters so very much. As we talk about the moral compass and the standing of America, I'll end it by how I started it. We have to be willing to talk to each other, look in the mirror, and see the example that we're setting on our own as well. But I'll tell you what, I will do everything that I can in my power to make sure that we do not have this president serving in the next 4 years. I don't know that our country can take it.
And with that, I want to say thank you for taking time to spend time with us. Such important issues.
Thank you. Mexico.
Not at all. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Ben Ray Lujan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman and Steve, and it was great to have you with us this morning. Our next conversation focuses on diversity in the U.S. workforce. Please welcome Elizabeth Marengo, Head of Diversity and Inclusion with Nestle USA, David Setfin, Chief Strategy and Engagement Officer of 2U, Catherine Zelensky, co-founder and president of Power to Fly, and Taryn Williams, managing director of the Poverty to Prosperity program with the Center for American Progress. Joining our panelists on stage is the Hill's Julia Manchester.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for what I know will be such a fascinating conversation about diversity in the workforce. So just to start off with all of you, and I'll put this to all of you, at the end of 2018, we saw that the U.S. workforce was much more diverse than years past. How have these great strides been made, and what work still needs to be done? I'll start with you first, Elizabeth.
Well, I think when you think about diversity and inclusion and, the efforts that companies have to make with really reflecting their consumer base and really making sure that the voice of their consumers, for us, Nestle, is really seen within their organization, you have to be really strategic about how you go out and recruit folks, making sure you have the right strategies internally to make sure that they're engaged in the organization. So, for us, making sure that we have that combined strategy kind of helps us make sure that we continue to move the needle in the space of D&I.
David, I'll go to you next.
I guess I work in the higher education space, and I think just like colleges and universities are beginning to grapple with the reality of the changing demographics of their student bodies, I think you're starting to see employers do that. And a lot of us were at a dinner last night. My sense is that most companies are still struggling pretty profoundly to make sense of how to do it. I mean, the reality is most leadership teams obviously do not reflect America. And I think what I've found historically is that if you as an individual leader don't have a diverse network yourself, a lot of the times when it comes to these conversations, you're at a bit of a disadvantage. And so one of the things that I always encourage leaders in my company, a lot of times they'll look at the person that has Elizabeth and say, hey, it's your responsibility to help us solve all these problems. And my response oftentimes is, whoever you are in the company, whether you're a member of a affinity group or whether you're one of the white guys who's running the business, everybody has to lean into this issue in order for us to move the dial. So if you don't have a diverse professional network, then you need to spend some time figuring out how to build that network, because hard to find talent usually comes from a network of trusted connections, and that's the way I think we can begin to move the dial.
Absolutely. And Catherine, I know you have a strong background in media and such, so talk about how diversity factors into that industry, because we know, and it's become very much a topic of conversation in the news media about the lack of diversity in a lot of these big media organizations. So how is that, how is that going so far?
Well, I've been out of the media world for a while. I mean, I can take it a click back and talk about the broader picture of how diversity is becoming something that companies are really looking at as a way to really grow the bottom line. Mm-hmm. And that also applies to newsrooms. So we talked about this with a couple of people here before, but if you look at the number of studies that have come out really in the last 2 years that are holding companies accountable when it comes to diversity in terms of how their profits are being generated, there's a lot of progress there. So there was a McKinsey study that came out in 2018 that showed that gender diverse executive teams are 21% more profitable within their industry mean. And so that's very powerful. Harvard Business Review studies that show that companies that are more diverse actually make better decisions. And so there's a lot of really interesting data there that executives are starting to collect and be exposed to. And that's really, really helping move the needle. And it's also tying everything from executive bonuses to team bonuses to building more diverse teams. So when you look at newsrooms, this also affects newsrooms as well. If newsrooms want to go out and reach bigger audiences, they want to have higher engagement rates, obviously they need to bring in more diverse team members. And I used to work at the Washington Post. I was the sixth person at the Huffington Post. If you wanted to broaden your audience, you had to bring in different voices to build that out. And so the company that I built out of my experiences in newsrooms, which were not very diverse at the time, was actually to build up data sets so that companies could bring in more diverse people. It's called Power to Fly. And the idea was that you would build funnels. You would treat it like a data problem where you could go out there, build new data sets of people, and literally go out there and invite people who had felt like they had been ostracized from these companies for years to come in and apply and feel like they could belong. So this is happening in newsrooms as well, and it's exciting to see.
Right. And Taryn, in terms of disability and hiring workers with disability, what is the status on that? Because we've seen that there's been more of a conversation about this in media in recent years, I would say, but it's not as talked about as much in the diversity conversation. Let's hear your take on that.
Sure. I think I would call it both a bad news and a good news. The bad news is that people with disabilities are still underemployed, unemployed, or not as active a part of the workforce as they could be. People with disabilities are 1 in 5 Americans across the country, and so often people don't consider that D when they're thinking about their diversity and inclusion efforts. And we are about 29 years past the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we know we still have so much work to do. If that's the bad news, then the good news is there has been a great amount of progress, particularly in the last 5 to 8 years, in part spurred by actions on the part of the federal government, but also from large global companies that are recognizing that disability is untapped talent. Disability is an area of the workforce where you can do some really innovative work, and quite frankly, there's a business case to be made as well. People with disabilities are also consumers. So you're starting to see that growth and that recognition across many different sectors that we need to proactively reach out to people with disabilities and not just bring someone in order to have them sit in a position, but rather to really bring them in and think about what does it take to build out a pipeline of people with disabilities who can then advance into C-suite.
Right. And David, you mentioned before your work in the higher education sector. Talk to us more about the link between diversity in higher education, how that translates into diversity in the workforce.
Well, I think, historically, just to you, we basically power the graduate degree and short courses and boot camps for top universities. And I think, interestingly, one of the theories behind the business in the first place was, why should you have to uproot your life and quit a job in order to get a great graduate education? So what we see in our business, our boot camp business, which is tech skills development, about 30% of those students don't have college degrees. About 45% of them are people of color or women. And in our graduate degree business, our programs are more diverse when it comes to women and people of color than campus-based programs. And part of the reason is of the flexibility. And if you think about traditionally underrepresented groups in the business world and in a lot of other industries, we live in a world now where if you don't get a graduate degree or continue your higher education, you're probably at a disadvantage. And if you didn't grow up in a family with a lot of wealth or you took on a decent amount of undergraduate debt, it's just not realistic for you to go back to graduate school and have to quit your job. And so what we're seeing is kind of our model and our universities being able to truly expand access. And then on the international stage, we have students from 150 different countries that are in our offering. So I genuinely believe, like it has in many other industries, it's taking a little bit longer, that the internet is going to be able to create much greater access for non-traditional learners. And I think the key is just making sure that the access that you're creating is to high quality education where employers and the value of the debt that you're taking on is worth it. I mean, I took out 6 figures of debt to go to law school. And debt is not the problem as long as it's the right kind of debt and you're actually getting a good outcome to pay for it because it creates access.
Right. Absolutely. And Elizabeth, we were talking before about how Nestle is relatively new to the Washington, D.C. metro area. So talk to us about how a company like Nestle, who's moved to a new metro area, is able to attract and recruit a diverse audience or a diverse workforce into its company.
We're really excited to be in the DMV area. We're based in the Arlington, Roslyn area, so we're really excited to be here. And I think it's interesting because I think Nestle, like many companies, if you think 10, 15 years ago, you had your recruiting strategies, your name was enough, right, to kind of get the talent that you needed. And but I think like many companies, you really have to be really creative. And I think creative to recruit, but then also a change of mindset internally. So when you talk about internally for us, a CPG company, historically we've gone after a lot of talent CPG. You come to the DC metro area and you're like, okay, well, it's different talent here, right? So, it's really been a really refreshing, to see some of our hiring managers look at different skill sets and different backgrounds. When we look at hiring, you look at military vets and the transferable skills. So we've kind of broadened even our thought process around what is the right talent and, what type of background really helps us as an organization and really diversify our ways of thinking and create new innovation. So that's exciting. But then also, like many organizations, not everybody's always knocking on the door, right, for a big company like Nestle. And so it's really made us be creative in our way of even introducing people to Nestle. So one of our newest kind of platforms is really just, even hosting getting to know sessions, right? So we just hosted here within our offices kind of a reception to get to know Nestle. So we just invited, people who were interested in the marketing, field or interested in getting to know Nestle just to meet us as a company, as an organization, to see if there's a mutual interest and really help us, to get more diverse talent. We've done the same thing in other campuses to specifically recruit diverse talent and be very purposeful in that space. So very different than just your, having a really good ad, on your careers website, right? Really kind of building stronger connections for people so that they get to know us as an organization.
Absolutely.
So,
And Kath, go ahead.
Oh, were you going to ask me? I just wanted to put a follow-up on that. Fantastic, everything you said. I wanted to, I see this across, what you were saying, I see this across dozens of companies, over 10% of the Fortune 500. We can benchmark how everybody's actually going out there and attracting underrepresented people to their company. But I wanted to ask the audience, how many, if you look at like a DMV like San Francisco, how many women, underrepresented women, do you think you need to reach out to get 100 in the room to apply to a company let's say, big tech company, Symantec, for example. I'm just going to throw out a name like that. Does anybody have a guess? 10x that. 10,000 to get 100 in the room. Wow. And how many times do you think you need to email them? 7. And then on top of that, how many times do you think you need to text message them? 10. So usually 1 or 2 times. But this speaks to the issue that when you're going out and you're trying to bring these populations into these companies, you said they're not necessarily knocking on the door, you really have to make them feel like they belong, that they can come in, they can actually talk to the company to see whether or not they will belong. Mm-hmm. Because through decades and decades, they've been told, no, you're not qualified, you're not going to belong here. And so, part of this is finding the people, but the other part of it is actually engaging them and giving them the opportunity to let them know that they can belong at these companies. So it's a data problem, it's a messaging problem, and it's an engagement and belonging issue. And so if you treat it like a pipeline funnel like that, then you actually start getting the results, but it takes huge numbers at the top of the funnel.
Yeah. And I know Power to Fly operates in multiple countries, I believe 12, is it?
We have employees in 12 countries.
Yeah. Okay, so, from your experience in working with those employees in 12 countries and expanding to those countries, do these places have the same diversity problems that the U.S. has, or is this exclusively an American problem?
No, it's not at all. I mean, this is a global problem, and America's actually behind certain companies. I think there was a report that came out recently that showed that gender parity in America will take something like 200 years, but in Western Europe it'll take less time. Yeah. I forget which country you could actually see gender parity in our lifetime. I was probably one of the Nordic countries. I can't remember, but there is a report out there that's really interesting, or in my daughter's lifetime, not in my lifetime. So it's definitely a global problem. We see Europe, for example, it's very hard now with GDPR. If you think about that from a recruiting perspective, it's harder to go out and actually invite people who normally wouldn't knock at the door at companies because of these kinds of regulations. So policy is very important when you think about this on a country-to-country basis. Obviously, GDPR affects European nationals in the U.S., but these are definitely global issues.
Yeah, and on that messaging front, Taryn, how do companies get that message out to disabled workers? How do they make them create more of an inclusive environment, make them feel welcome, like they're wanted in a workspace?
Sure. I mean, you already heard a lot of it echoed here from my co-panelists. You need a robust amount of companies across the country really creating to that culture of belonging, really encouraging workers to do the self-identification, to connect with their ERGs, their employee resource groups, and to make sure that they are coming to work as their full selves. That takes a lot of time, though, and it's not just about the posters that we put up and the webinars that we do. We also need to have the policies in place to ensure that workers can actually do the job. As someone with a non-apparent disability, I pay very close attention to an accommodation policy that a company has. So it's clear that you need to do a front-facing sort of full suite of policies to ensure that people with disabilities are able to identify and feel welcome in your company, but you also need to make sure that you're talking to those same people. Oftentimes in the disability culture, they'll say nothing for us without us. So you're talking to them and you're ensuring that they are equipped to do the job to the best of their abilities.
Right, and I'm going to do more of a general question. My day job, I cover politics at the Hill, so during the 2018 midterm elections, I got to cover, the most diverse class we've seen of the 2018 Congress. We've also seen it in state houses across the nation. How does the increasing diversity of Congress and other levels of the government or state governments impact the workforce? David, I'll start with you.
Well, I had the pleasure of spending, 7 years of my career on the Hill. I was Chief of Staff to Harold Ford, and then I was Senator Kennedy's General Counsel on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And like any other part of society, the lack of, I think now there's maybe one black Chief of Staff on the Hill on the Senate side or something like that, very few women. So, what excites me is both the generational change, but also having, particularly more women leaders. I grew up in a family with 4 older sisters, so I feel very comfortable on this panel. I think that one of the things that we need to do as a society is kind of acknowledge the fact. People, the older I've gotten, I've realized, and you see it happening right now, people don't give up power. You got to take it. And I think one of the things that is interesting is the degree to which there's a consistency of what's happening across society, whether you see it in politics, whether you see it in the Me Too movement and the like, is just a growing accountability and demand for influence and a seat at the table. And so I think it's great. I mean, one thing that I will say is, we talked earlier about kind of allyship. In this conversation, I think it's also really important for folks who feel that change of power structure to realize that if you embrace it, it can also be empowering for you as well. Because I've always believed that we are collectively stronger, and as a Democrat, I obviously work for Senator Kennedy. It excites me how the party is changing, starting to reflect America.
Right, absolutely. Elizabeth, what's your
Yeah,
take
I
on
would just say, just to add, I think, not only, what's happening in the government, but I think social media, just the influence in the workplace, I think is just more informed employees that are going to require more of their companies, right? And so, I'm constantly challenged in a good way, right? I think it keeps us on our toes as organizations to make sure we're addressing the needs of our employees, to make sure that they feel welcomed and engaged and that their voice is being heard from whatever group that you participate in. We just launched our Thrive, which is our disability network, right? Just, being informed about what's happening and what accommodations they might need if they're an ally, a caregiver, right? So, I think, this next generation, or just employees in general in the workforce, the influence that media, what's happening in politics, just allows them to be more informed, which is great, but helps companies be better, right? Helps us figure out where we should be investing, what policies should we be looking at, what type of environment should we have, what should our next training program look like. So, I think that with the noise or the conversations that are happening externally, it's a good challenge, I think, for companies.
Absolutely, and I just want to give our audience a heads up. In about 2 minutes or so, we'll start to take audience questions, so start to think of those if you have any coming up. So, Catherine, what's your take on that? How does the more diverse Congress, more diverse state houses across the country impact recruitment and diversity in companies?
Well, I live in Brooklyn now, so I'm a little sheltered. But I have to say, it's and I used to live in DC, so I used to obsess on this. Obviously, it's incredibly motivating to see it, but to the point, we have policy that actually reflects the demographics of the United States, which is really exciting, and it speaks to this larger point that if you want to make anything stronger, you need to have the voices in there that actually represent the people that you're serving. And so that's, I think it's wonderful.
Absolutely. And Taryn, before we take questions from the audience, just want to get your take on that.
It's an interesting question. I think of the power of the pulpit. I work on an anti-poverty team, and so we spend a lot of time thinking about the systemic barriers that prevent people from really rising up the career ladder. And when someone like Senator Baldwin tweets about her inability to move between Chicago and DC without damage to her wheelchair, she is putting a very powerful face on the transportation barriers that people with disabilities might confront when they're looking for gainful employment. Their inability to access the type of work events or the amount of travel that really would allow them to move up in their roles. So there is something to be said about that mix of who is there, social media, and really a group of Congress folks who are really putting a spotlight on so many things that we haven't talked about.
Absolutely, and now I'll open it up to you guys. If anyone has any questions, we'll have someone with a microphone come around. They'll choose you guys. I think there's a couple of people.
Way in the back, yeah.
Oh, I think, yeah. One of these guys, yeah.
This side is very active. Yes. So warm up a little bit.
Hi, my name is Angela Arboleda. I run a small company called Innovar Strategies. And it is true that diversity and the new Congress has given more insight about the importance of diversity. But how do you really get to companies and to congressional offices and to lobbying shops and to all kinds of different sectors and say, you really do need to hire these people. These people are going to make a difference, not only in terms of policy, but also the bottom line. Because I think everybody talks about it, but in reality, when you try to put it into play, it's a different thing. And good to see you, David.
Yeah, anyone who wants
Well,
to
I mean,
speak
I
there?
guess I'll start for us. We keep the conversation of talent and diversity pretty active in every conversation. I mean, our executives are always talking about it. I mean, we know from a consumer perspective that, females have 70% of the buying power within their homes, right? We know that, from an African American, perspective that, their likelihood to buy in organizations, is 30 to 40% more committed if they know that the company reflects their social issues. We know that, the Hispanic population, especially millennials, they're 50% more likely to share something on social media if they're bought into the products that, and feel that they're represented and supportive, right? So I think when you're able to connect the actual facts about what those communities and how they influence the bottom line and keep that present, and then can layer in a second part of that conversation and ask, okay, well, how are they represented, right? If we look at our marketing organization, do we have those people in our marketing department? Do we have that represented in our HR organization when we're recruiting these folks, right? And so, I think we do a really good job at keeping talent and people, first in our organization. Our CEO is very, very bought into the importance and really supports and drives the importance of people and people leadership. And so the conversation of talent and being able to have innovative mindset, a real collaborative spirit is really important to us. So, we keep it active in every conversation, making sure that we're trying our best to promote and develop and nurture. We're not perfect, but I think one thing that helps it is keeping the conversation active, which we do.
Absolutely. Yes.
I love piggybacking on your fantastic answer. One thing that I see across all these companies across the world is talent acquisition is still a cost center. And to all your points, once we start quantifying the ROI of a diverse talent and show how powerful that is and take talent acquisition from being a cost center to a growth center, we're going to really see the change that we need. It's incredibly disheartening to often see how tight the budgets are around diversity and inclusion. And I just told you how much work it is to go out and target these groups of people. Target's sounds like a bad word, but it is data work, it is collection work, it is messaging work. It takes bodies on the ground to bring people in. And that costs quite a bit of money when you think about it to do it right. And I don't think there's some companies that are starting to spend and really understand it, but we're so far right now from the real cost and energy and effort that it needs to take to build truly diverse teams, that my goal over the next 2 years is to really open that up and go to company and say, this company is doing it this way, this is what they're spending, this is the ROI. You need to do this if you want to be competitive on Wall Street, for example. If Goldman Sachs wants to compete against JP Morgan. And so those kinds of data and that numbers is what's really starting to drive the conversation more, and I'm seeing it happen, but that I think will lead to the results that we need to see.
Absolutely, yes, David.
I've now been in DC for almost 25 years, and having worked on the Hill, worked at a trade association for a company, as a lobbyist, ran the Washington office of a global PR firm, and now in-house in a company. My sense is there's no facet of that world that doesn't have kind of structural diversity challenges. My sense is that probably we need more people to be a little more risk takers. I think when people, the number of times I've given kind of advice to young people on the Hill about it's okay to leave and go try something else, and they don't want to leave for whatever reason. And so my view is you basically need to understand how, if you're in Washington at least, understand how this town works and how all the interrelated facets of influence shape what happens, and be intentional about trying to figure out a place where you can go. The analogy that I use is, if you're driving a car, riding a bike, or you're a pedestrian, and you come up to a stoplight, and there's chaos. If you've only done one of those three things, you have a different perspective. We've all come to a green light, and you're the pedestrian, you're walking, and you're looking at the car who's turning, and you're like, would you get out of my way? I have the light. And if you're driving, you look at the pedestrian, you get out of the way. The way to have impact and influence in a place like Washington is to have the perspective of all of those roles. And so I always encourage young people to be a little bit more bold and risk-taking earlier in their career, to find something that is different than what they've done, because I think that's the way that you break down barriers, and you also set yourself up for greater success. So down the road, when it comes time to hire the next chief of staff or run the Washington office of a firm, you have the kind of experience that you need in order to be a real influence player in this town. So.
Absolutely. And I think on that note, we're actually out of time for questions, so I'm sorry about that. But thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you to you guys. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to our panelists and to Julia. Great to hear your insights. To learn more about the efforts to make the healthcare space more diverse and inclusive, please welcome on stage Dr. Georges Benjamin, Executive Director of the American Public Health Association, and Dr. Lena Wen, Visiting Professor of Health Policy and Management at George Washington University School of Public Health. Joining the doctors on stage is the Hill's Raphael Bernal. Raphael?
Good morning. Well, thank you for being here. I've been reading about the link between diversity and healthcare in general, and it seems that what always comes up is disparities. It's not the same if you grew up in LA, if you grew up in the middle of the country, if you grew up in the South. And it's not the same depending your racial composition. Your outlook on life is not the same. Lena, let's start with you. What's driving that? Is it poverty? Is it race itself? Is it cultural differences?
Well, first of all, Raphael, thank you for moderating this panel, and good morning to everyone. I'm glad to be here with all of you and also with my colleague and public health hero, Dr. Georges Benjamin. I'm glad that we're starting out by talking about disparities in the context of diversity too, which I know is the purpose of the summit, but health disparities, I think it's important for us to talk about as health care and health. Typically we confuse these two, but I actually think it's important to delineate them, because health care is the care that we literally receive, and absolutely that care is influenced by many factors, including, unfortunately, by the structural racism that's present in our healthcare system. And of course, access to that healthcare also depends on many other factors like transportation and other factors that are tied to socioeconomic status, to geography, to race, et cetera. But there's the other element too that I think is important to focus on, which is that of health. And studies have shown that up to 90% of what determines how long and how well you live is not just the care that you literally receive in a hospital, but all the other factors in your life. The food that you may have access to, the education, the poverty that surrounds your area. And I think the example of this comes from my city in Baltimore, where a child born today, depending on what neighborhood he or she happens to be born into, can expect to live 85 years or 65 years. And that's not just, we have 11 acute care hospitals in our city. It's not just the care that they can receive. It's all these other factors too. And I think in these conversations about diversity and disparities, we have to keep in mind that choice, that notion of choice, is predicated on privilege. And that our job as healthcare professionals, as public health leaders, has to be figuring out how we can level the playing field of inequality so that where a child happens to be born into and happens to live no longer determines if they live.
Thank you. So I have a feeling we're gonna talk about Maryland a lot today. we're going to use it as an example. George, so when you're looking at Maryland and at poverty, these disparities in healthcare, this is a staggering difference. Living 65 years versus 85 years. This is 20 years out of a person's life. How much does healthcare and healthcare policy, how much can that move that needle?
Well, it can certainly move it some. You know, if you have a heart attack, it moves it a lot. But I think that the big challenge you have is that let's think red line here. Everyone who came in today, many of you probably came on the red line. The life expectancy, if you live here, right where we are right now, it's about 72 years. At the end of the red line, it's 84 years. I mean, the bottom line is a year of life expectancy is a big deal. Those of you who've been in Washington, D.C. for a long time know that, you know, we track infant mortality in Washington, D.C., like most communities, a lot. And when it goes up, you know, 0.2 of a point, people applaud. When it goes down 1/10 of a point, you know, people scramble, want to figure out what went wrong. A year life expectancy is a big deal. So everything Lena said is right. I mean, access to care is important, but the structures that we have built, we've constructed this system to be disparate for many folks. And yeah, behavior plays a role, but if you're going to get someone to want to exercise, you know, you've got to have sidewalks that aren't cracked and leveled. You've got to have street signs that are lighted at night so you can see where you're going, so you don't get hit by a car. So that communities have to be walkable, bikeable, and green. And if they're not, people are unlikely to walk. And so that creates one of the structural challenges we always talk about.
So we're talking a lot about poverty seems to be one of the common denominators here. Lena, in terms of women's health, because I mean, we talk about diversity, we have a tendency to move towards race, but there's also, you know, there's diversity comes in a lot of ways, and women's health is one of the crucial factors in human life, right?
I mean, half of us here are women.
It's just
so true.
And all of us were born
and continuing human life. But how are those disparities accentuated among different socioeconomic and is there a racial or ethnic component to those disparities?
You know, it's interesting when we talk about disparities. I used to show, when I started presentations, of a map of Baltimore City. And I actually stopped showing that map because it almost didn't matter what color codes you put in the legend, is the same map. As in the same map that shows high infant mortality also corresponds to high gun violence, also is the highest rates of cardiovascular disease, is also the highest rates of overdose. It's because all these factors that you mentioned, Raphael, are interrelated. Whether it's women's health or people's health, I mean, it's all interrelated. And I think that's why it's, at some point I stopped showing the map, also because I thought we needed to stop admiring the problem. Because you can do, and I'm all for research, you know, I'm back being an academic, and so have to say that research in science and policymaking is really important, but at some point, you gotta stop studying the disparities and talk about solutions. I think from Baltimore too, we can see that there are a lot of solutions that we've implemented that do work in terms of moving the needle of health outcomes. Not enough, but that do work. We started a program called Be More for Healthy Babies that specifically addressed infant mortality in our city. And within 7 years of this program, we reduced infant mortality across the city by 38%. And I think the most important part of this is not only the reduction in infant mortality, the statistic itself, but also because we specifically focused on reducing the gap between Black and white infant mortality and called out that metric as an important metric of success. We also significantly reduced that disparity. Actually, we closed the gap between Black and white infant mortality in our city by over 50%. So I think talking about these solutions and why they work and the layers of the solutions, because as Georgia said, it's not just about the care. It's also, sometimes as a physician, I feel disingenuous telling my patients, you got to eat healthier foods. When my patient says to me, but I have to take 2 buses and then walk 10 blocks. Or else what's in my neighborhood is a corner store that the closest thing that it comes to having a vegetable is a bag of chips and an old banana that's 3 weeks old. I mean, we look at in my city, 1 in 12 white people live in a food desert without access to healthy foods. 1 in 3 African Americans live in a food desert. And so how can we also level the playing field through access to all these other factors as a way to improve health outcomes?
And, to demonstrate the power of place, I mean, if you look at Putnam and Mason County, West Virginia, I don't know if anyone here is from West Virginia, but these are 2 counties right next to one another. Mostly white, I think somewhere between 70, 80% white, with a 2-year life expectancy between these 2 counties. They have enormous differences in county capacity and policies and things like that. Place matters, and that's what Lena's pointing out. We've structured these things, so that they give you the outcomes that you see. And you look, everyone says, well, we didn't know. No, everyone knew. It's called the other side of the tracks. Every community has a main avenue. You look left, you see one series of economic outcomes. You look right, you see a different set of economic outcomes. Every neighborhood has that. Every city has that.
So I'm a little bit shocked that the numbers you gave, the infant mortality numbers, you're talking what would translate over a decade to thousands of years of human lives put together. Like this is how, and it seems like.
And it's preventable.
And it's preventable. And I don't remember reading a story where somebody in Washington came up with an overall solution to the nation's healthcare. What's the low-hanging fruit? We'll ask about Congress in a second, but from the healthcare industry perspective, what is the low-hanging fruit to get these outcomes, to sort of hit the ball out of the park on what's already there?
Funding, we can start by adequately funding the public health system, dealing with things like physical inactivity, diet, exercise, and tobacco. If this nation was serious about the leading preventable cause of death, which is tobacco. If you look at the 5 leading causes of death in this country, they're all linked back to tobacco. And let's start with that. Then we can pivot to other substances. We can pivot to mental health by building systems to do that. Spending a lot more money on the prevention side than we are on the sickness side. We need to fix the sickness side when we get sick. But, we spend very little money on prevention and wellness. And just about the time we think we got our hands around it, they pull the money back. That's happened on vaccines, tuberculosis, tobacco, vaccines. It's a shame. And we know how to fix these problems. We go to other countries and help them resolve them all the time. And yet we don't take those same lessons and put them into our inner cities or our rural communities.
I'm going to get political for a second. Does that mean, are you proposing that Medicare for all is a solution? Because I know some politicians that we see on TV sometimes say that. Yeah,
prevention for all. We need to have a system with everyone in, everyone out, for sure. And we need to pay for it. And I can, if you gave me the federal budget today, I would have no problem finding the money, because to pay for this is a rounding error in the federal budget.
Actually, this really reminds me, Georges, of the quote about public health, that public health saved your life today, you just don't know it. That by definition, there is no face of public health, right? Because public health works when the thing that's a bad outcome didn't happen. Yeah. So if we're talking about infant mortality, it's the babies, the newborns that would have died, but you prevented the infant mortality from occurring. So what is the face of that? Or what is the face? You have the face of a child who was lead poisoned. But what's the face of a child who was not lead poisoned? And then did have educational opportunities and did succeed in school and did have it's hard. And I think that's why public health ends up being the first thing on the chopping block. But that's why, in the words of my mentor and I think our beloved hero, Congressman Elijah Cummings, he always talked about how the cost of doing nothing isn't nothing.
That's right.
That we have to always talk about the cost of inaction. And that's what I hope our policymakers will focus on, and that's why your emphasis on prevention, I think, is our emphasis on prevention is so critical. It's to talk about the cost of inaction and why investing in public health, preventing people from getting sick in the first place, is so critical.
Now, let's talk about the patients a little bit, because regardless of however many investments are made to build the capacity, patients need to know to go to the doctor, was it once a year? Was that all right?
Yeah.
All right.
At least.
Well, let's say once a year.
As needed.
But patients need to know this, and there are different subsets. You go from undocumented immigrants who often don't go to the doctor for fear of approaching institutions in general. There's a connection between those institutions and the immigration institution, and they'll end up in the emergency room when when things have become critical. This is also true of people with low education who don't know to go to the doctor. So from the patient side, how do you address, supposing we use that rounding error, it's fully funded, how do you get the patient in the door in the first place?
Yeah, you've got to continue to make the system not confrontational. You've got to have people there that they trust. That clinician-patient relationship is very sacred. Having someone that looks like you or has your experiences can be important for many, many patients. We have real challenges with workforce. When I graduated from medical school in 1978, that was the peak of African Americans in medical school, graduating from medical school. That was about 9%, and it's fallen from there. We only have about 4% of practicing physicians that are African American. This speak for African American physicians, much less if you're Native American, and only about 6%, are in the pipeline right now. And while we've done a little bit better at increasing, science, technology, and then math students, nowhere is near enough to fuel the medicine pipeline. So as we age and this country becomes more diverse, there'll be many, many less people that are diverse providing care for those patients.
So what difference does it make for a patient to have a practitioner that looks like them?
A lot. And I'll just speak from my personal experiences. There is the aspect of that looks like them, but it's also the understanding the cultural background and being sensitive to that as well. My mother, when she was in her 40s, went through a year of misdiagnoses before she was finally diagnosed with what turned out to be metastatic breast cancer. And I had gone with her to one of the early appointments, and I just saw, the doctor had looked at her and saw a pretty healthy-looking middle-aged woman who was a school teacher and was feeling run down, and said, "Oh, you've got a cold." And she said, "But wait a minute, I couldn't have had a cold for weeks." And then the doctor said, "Well, maybe you're depressed. Take some antidepressants." And I saw the look on her face in that moment of she knew that she didn't have depression, and that was not the issue. But she also was so scared to speak up, because in our culture, and also we had come to this country as immigrants, and just with her language and culture, she thought that if she had spoken up, her doctor would fire her, because that's the cultural context that she came from. And I always think back to that moment, because had she been diagnosed earlier, who knows what would have happened. I mean, she passed away about 10 years ago now. And so I think there's a lot to be fixed in our healthcare system, recognizing that the change does begin with each of us. That while we wait for the system to change, there are things that we can do also to advocate for better health outcomes for ourselves and our loved ones.
We also know that diverse practitioners are much more likely to go back into the communities they came from. So that also helps with the workforce issue.
Is the current workforce, do medical practitioners today have the necessary training for a diverse patient base? Do they know to the degree in which different diseases or conditions affect different ethnicities? Are you confident that what exists today, just from a scientific standpoint?
The answer is not at all. There are many physicians today, for example, who think that African Americans can tolerate more pain than whites. They believe that. They were taught that somewhere along the way. It's the lack of real cultural competency and understanding. The assumption, if you come into an emergency department in the middle of the night and you're in your tracksuit, that you're on a low-income program, Medicaid, whatever, or you're uninsured. I know that many physicians who have brought their kids into the hospital at night, because we don't like to practice on our kids. We do watch the doc what they're doing, but we don't like to practice on our kids, have often been assumed to be on Medicaid or uninsured. And, you always, at some point, you always have to let them know you know a little bit more than you know. But it happens, there are numerous physicians that have had that experience when they've taken their own families to the hospital.
Start getting your questions ready. I'm gonna ask one more. It's an easy one, don't worry. How do we get politics out of healthcare? Or how do we use politics correctly within healthcare? I mean, one issue, you've worked with Planned Parenthood. It's a politically very active name, and it can be a third rail for some people. But you said that you wrote that the most effective way to advance reproductive health is to be clear that it is not a political issue but a healthcare one. That seems on its face true, but how do you implement that in the current political environment?
Well, look, I come to this work as a physician first and foremost, and as a scientist and a person who is grounded in the values of public health. And to me, when I see patients coming to seek healthcare, whatever that healthcare is, whether it's birth control, whether it's abortion care, whether it's blood pressure and diabetes screening, people are not trying to make a political statement. My patients are coming to me in order to get healthcare, to care for themselves, to care for their families. And that's always my North Star and the North Star of the people that I serve. Now, it is unfortunate that healthcare has become politicized and political, especially women's healthcare, reproductive healthcare, and other aspects too. I still think, though, that for those of us in public health, for those of us working directly with our patients, that it's important to stay grounded and not just be caught up in what we're fighting about, but who we're fighting for.
We would like to take some questions from the audience. I see a hand right over there. You'll get a microphone in a second.
Good morning. Thanks for being here. I am Lori Maez, and I live in Arlington. I think it's so important that we get information out. Because I have a granddaughter who was born with spina bifida. She's 5 years old. Fortunately, her family has the resources, and she'll be okay. There'll be a lot of challenges. But my daughter-in-law and my son, they recently went to the school and they talked to her classmates about spina bifida, about how different we all are. And it was really a neat conversation with the kids. And my daughter-in-law, fortunately, she's fluent in Spanish, and she meets with a lot of families, Spanish-speaking families, because they don't know who to go to. And somehow she meets them at a playground, at a coffee shop, and it's getting information out. So I think that's very vital about being informed.
You're raising a very important point there. We haven't talked about, are we equipped to deal with diversity of conditions? People, spina bifida, the first time somebody encounters somebody with spina bifida, are we teaching people enough to be able to accommodate where it's accommodating and treat people like human beings?
Yeah, it's a good news, bad news story. The good news is that if you want to find out something, you can go to Dr. Google and get that information. It used to be held by us guilds. We used to have all the information, and we shared it whenever we felt like it. But now with the internet, you can find a lot more. The bad news is there's a lot of misinformation out there. And we do need to invest a lot more in that, getting good information out, and going and encouraging people to go to trusted sources. Obviously, professional associations, the Heart Association, your maybe insurance plan, the health department, but finding sources that you trust, because in the days when many people got their health information from really good sources, Auntie Sue, Uncle Joe, and the barber, we actually used that here in Washington, D.C. when I was the health officer here. We worked with the barbers and beauticians in the city to make sure that they were literate around HIV and AIDS. They helped us better educate communities around the transmission of the disease. It was early in the AIDS epidemic. So finding trusted messengers who may not be the usual messengers, giving them the information, making sure they're qualified to give that information, because people are going to always go, to Uncle John and Auntie Sue. They're always going to go to their barber and their beautician for information.
Does this fit in within cultural competency? If you know a community, you know to go to the barber or the beautician.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it's also, I think it's a core public health principle, right, of finding the trusted messengers, as you were saying, and reaching people where they are. We as physicians in the exam room, we do have a level of credibility with our patients. But there are a lot of patients who may listen to us and nod and say fine, but then continue to do what they were going to do because they might not believe. They might themselves have the experience of putting a baby on facing downward when they were young, and they don't understand the importance of back to sleep and putting the baby on the back. And so I use that example because top of mind, I have a 2-year-old and I'm pregnant, and so I think a lot about the ABCs of safe sleep. But but I think I saw this a lot in Baltimore too, in my work, that you do need that trusted messenger. And I think that's a lot of the work that we have to do in workforce too, recognizing that community health workers, aides, so many other people are even better at reaching people in their communities, at promoting the health information and education that we really need.
And putting that information out in multiple languages. I think we printed our information in 15, 16 different languages, and recognized it's not just the language, but there's also different dialects. Spanish isn't just Spanish. There are many ways, as you know, and words that are different depending on the cultural context of that. It's important. And we've got to invest in some things to really help people understand, even within our institutions. So I've practiced emergency medicine for a long time, and one of the stories I often talk about is the fact that we often, I don't speak Spanish, I know that's one of my failures, but I would always have to get someone to help interpret my talking to a patient who's Spanish speaking. And sometimes that was the maintenance person in the hospital, whose literacy and health is questionable, but even worse, sometimes it was their kid. And sometimes you're having a kid translate very sensitive information from their parent isn't the best situation.
Well, that's all the time we have today, so please give a round of applause. Thank you both.
Thank you again to our doctors and Raphael. Next up, a conversation on empowering the next generation of workers. Please welcome to the stage Susie Armstrong, Senior Vice President of Engineering with Qualcomm, and Kalea Cook, a student at Annandale High School. And please welcome back the Hill's Editor-at-Large, Steve Clemens.
Today, one of the great fun things of being editor-at-large of anything is you have, a good title and you're not really responsible for anything. But you get to meet fascinating people, and I just got to meet an incredible, fascinating person here, student Kalea Cook. But before Kalea, I met Susie Armstrong, and we met recently in a program. We were looking at mobility and how 5G, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, all of the converging of all sorts of technologies are literally going to transform the options that we have on so many different fronts. What's going to happen within cities and how our lives will be different when sensors are communicating to different sensors and our phones. And Susie Armstrong is the person responsible, and you should all know that she's a real hero, that her technology that she invented is in all of your cell phones. So your ability to search, how many of you have been on the web on your phone this morning? Everyone. How many of you have done a photograph or taken a picture or a selfie and sent it to someone? Those are the things that Susie Armstrong invented in Qualcomm. So give her a round of applause, because you would not be having as much fun, right? So Qualcomm is a fascinating company. So this is not about Qualcomm. This is about great minds changing the world and doing things. And Susie happens to be one of the leading, in my view, female technologists in the nation. And I was, along with another friend of mine, Ellen Stofan. Some of you may know Ellen is the chief scientist, former chief scientist at NASA. She now heads the National Air and Space Museum. These are phenomenal women. And I just want to know, what do we do to get more of them? And why don't we have more of them? So Susie, why don't we have more of you?
So I think, there's a lot of people in the diversity arena who will say it's not just a pipeline issue, and it is not just a pipeline issue, but pipeline is table stakes. And so we at Qualcomm, and I think you've heard of a lot of other programs as well, we at Qualcomm really focus on getting especially underrepresented students interested in STEM and STEM careers. Because if you think about it, it's STEM and STEM careers, even if you go into, business or you go into some of these other careers, if you have a STEM background, that just opens your doors to being Susie Armstrong. I never really thought of it that way. But I think that's a big part of the challenge, is the pipeline. And why do we have such a pipeline problem? I think traditionally, whether it's girls or whether it's kids of color, don't see themselves in engineering jobs. Somebody said to me, well, I thought engineers sat in a dark lab with, a pocket protector. I'm going to go on eBay and find a pocket protector. But our labs definitely aren't dark. So I think there's cultural barriers and there's practical barriers, and but it's really.
But you're trying to move the needle, particularly for young girls and folks like our special guest here, about how they encounter and have experiences with technology. And then there's this program called Think a Bit. You guys should all go Google it. Think a Bit. You can do it on your phones and give Susie credit. But Think a Bit is a program that helps expose young children. So tell us just a little bit about Think a Bit, and then we'll get to Kalea.
Okay. So Think a Bit Lab is a hands-on STEM engagement program. There's a lot of wonderful STEM education programs out there. Qualcomm is full of technologists, not necessarily educators. And
are any of them fun?
They're all fun.
The technologists?
They're all fun.
That's good.
Like me.
Right.
I'm trying to be fun. Think a Bit Lab is this hands-on STEM engagement, and there's three sort of premises. It is free for underrepresented kids. We work with a lot of Title I schools, but we don't turn away anybody. It's not a competition, and we also sponsor and are very involved in FIRST Robotics, which I can talk about later. I love that program, but I think it's really important when you're exposing students to STEM careers for the first time that you sort of pull them in. You don't weed them out with a competition. And it's not a prescribed outcome. And so you're not building a kit that has to look like a certain thing. And so you get all these wonderful inventions like Kalea's and like the sample I have here. So that's what Think of It Lab is a hands-on STEM engagement program. And we also do it in the context of careers, because how can a student aspire to a career that they don't exist? So we have these are some of the career cards we put together with one of our ag tech partners in rural California. And for some of the careers in ag tech, we also have a whole stack of careers that we do at Qualcomm that we engage the kids with as well.
So, Kalea, I understand that you're active in Think of It. You've been doing it for a few years now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what has been your experience?
Like going there and then seeing that, because they have a really cool wall there where you can just grab things off and then like make whatever you want. And then like learning there, and then it's really colorful and it's just really fun to be around there and stuff, yeah.
So I hear you're really great at math and science.
Mm-hmm.
Do those turn you on? Is that your thing? Are you a mathlete?
I guess.
So tell me about some of the things that you built.
So I've like in 7th grade, I think we were doing eco-friendly things, and I built like these palm trees that like spin, and they also like have solar panels on them that like give you like energy from the sun.
So the solar energy
Yeah.
funds the spinning of the palm trees?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Other
Where can I get one?
I don't know.
And what else have you done?
Oh my gosh, it's been so long. We built like 3D printed like projects. We built like cars and stuff, and then see which ones like go the fastest and why they go the fastest. We've built like hurricane things. I forgot. Like a sensor that like if a hurricane's coming, it will tell you that a hurricane's coming, and it's easy, so you don't have to get it off the like news or whatever.
So barometric pressure kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And has it changed what you, I mean, I know this is an unfair question because, you know, always ask a young person what they want to be. I almost feel like it's too much pressure to ask. But do you feel like some of the things that you have done have given you options about what you might want to do in your future?
Yeah, because I don't really have an idea of what I want to be yet, but it does help me like think of like what I might want to do or like how it's going to help me in something I do end up doing.
I just met your mom. She seems pretty cool.
She is.
Yeah. So does your mom help you with your Think of It stuff?
Yeah, I usually have her like...
She's pretty intense, your mom.
Yeah.
I'm sure she's a great mom.
She is.
So tell her about your mom and Think of It and how she's been supportive.
She's kind of like what put me in STEM, because I didn't really ever hear about STEM before I got into middle school, and she just signed me up for it, and I was like, oh, really? But but it ended up like helping me in like all of my other classes, and like she's helped me a lot. So.
Oh, that's great. I want to ask you to show you things, but before I ask you to do this, I know, Susie, you were going to show us some of the things that kids interact with from the lab, which I think is in that tub. Is that right? So can you tell us what a child's exposure, how you get them brought in, and what does an encounter of a young person with Think of It stuff look like? Oh, that's all together. I thought it was like a little furry fuzzball.
Yeah, no, this is the real thing. So this is a project that we did with...
Why don't you show it up to the room?
This is a project that 2 high schoolers did in Porterville, California, very rural area, agricultural and mining. And we did a week-long camp there. So we have one-day experiences, and we do week-long camps too.
Now you can turn it my way because I have to see what it is. Okay.
Yeah, first tree I've ever seen with a mustache.
Is it going to do something? Does it do something?
I don't have the power pack here, but this piece, what we're trying to resolve. These were all farmers' kids, and so this is an Arduino board, which is an open source, very inexpensive board, and then this is a temperature sensor here. And so like Kalea's project, in Think a Bit Lab, you learn about careers, you learn about some simple programming and microelectronics, and then you go up to the craft wall and you build an invention of your own idea. And so these kids built this. They had a problem on the farm with figuring out when trees should be fertilized, because apparently. Now, this is the extent of my agricultural knowledge. Apparently, trees are very sensitive to temperature in terms of when they should be fertilized and when they shouldn't. And so the temperature sensor actually is triggered when it gets warm enough to be fertilized, and then this project sends, if it was powered, sends the data to a tablet, and then the farmer can say, okay, it's time to fertilize. And so what we stress, what is cool about this in Kalea's project is what we stress is you make a project from a problem that you see, not that what we see. And so, and I love the mustache
tree. So what they
tree.
saw is the mustache on the tree, and so all the little fur balls, that's the tree.
That's the tree.
And I mean, I kind of wish that they made, so like the tree is like bouncing up, fertilize me.
Yes, exactly. Oh, I like the movement idea.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, Kalea, why don't you show us your cool project which you brought in?
Okay.
Show us what you've made. And can I just tell you, this is actually a really cool project. I have this problem, which I will share.
We all do.
I
think she could go into business tomorrow and maybe make a fortune.
Well, let me just say before you do this, how many of you, I mean, what is the urban stems? Anybody buy urban stems for people? You know, you get the little dinosaurs and all this. So there's a company called Urban Stems, and you can get in a little white vase a very nice little orchid that someone sends you, and I just can't throw them away. So the orchids may go away, but there's a little plant there, and so I've got like a forest of Urban Stems non-orchid bearing plants, and I have them, that's true, and I have them in a window. And what happens is they all grow, because I am not that good a steward of them, but I water them once a month, and they stay alive. But they all become lopsided and hanging way over, because that's where the sun is. So we'll use that as the preamble. Does anybody have that problem? Be brave. Yeah, there you do. You know what I'm saying. There's one person. Okay. So show us how you're going to fix our Urban STEM challenge.
Okay, so it would be powered right now, but I don't have anything to power it. It spins really.
Next year we'll fix that.
Yes,
Yeah.
It spins very slowly.
So explain what it is. It's a spin-o-matic flower pot.
Yes, my mom came up with that name. It spins very slowly to get sunlight from around. Otherwise, because my mom's plants, they usually grow towards the sun and look sad. And then, but if it gets sunlight from all around, then it will grow straight up, and it'll be really pretty.
So go straight. Are these real, or are these just?
No, they were from Alea flowers.
Oh, okay. Very, very nice. Well, yeah. So this spins, and how fast does it move around? Very slowly.
Yeah, you can. I'm sure. Depends on how fast you want it, but I don't want it too fast. It's as slowly, maybe, I don't know, but it'll.
Well, it's great. Well, I want them, and I want to know when you start production, so we can talk about that later, and then we can sign up the team, the crowd here to get it. Let me ask. So, what are some of the other things? Have you watched what some of your other student friends have made as their projects?
Yeah, someone in a lower grade than me, his name is Anthony. He made this garage sensor thing that if you back up into the garage, then it will beep and tell you not to hit the back of the garage, and it will turn on lights for you, and then it was really cool. He's in 7th grade.
Fascinating. So one of the things I'm interested in is how long has Think a Bit been in place?
It's been in place about 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
We started in San Diego at our headquarters, looking at, actually it was started out of 2 observations, engineers wanting their kids to have some exposure to STEM programs, and then this observation that we would not have anybody to hire or use our technology if we don't do some work around the pipeline issue. And the other thing I wanted to mention about Think a Bit Lab, like our other STEM programs, it's a wonderful internal employee engagement mechanism as well. We get a lot of volunteers through our ambassador program. With First Robotics, we actually fund do small funding for all of the teams. Any team that an employee is going to be a First Robotics coach and mentor of gets some funding as well. And so a lot of parents come into the STEM world via their kids and these kinds of, and employees in these kinds of programs as well.
Is there enough going on? I mean, it occurs to me, I used to go to an annual dinner. It was the Intel Science Awards. And for those of you who know the Intel world, they also would do, this was the successor to the Westinghouse Awards. And these were young innovators that were coming up with science prizes, and it was the things we would see in the movies. But I didn't know we were still doing that kind of thing. And I went one year with the CEO of Intel, and I met a woman, young woman in college that had done something fantastic with in the bio space. That was, I can't remember what it was, but it was just incredible. And Intel wanted to invest in it later. But it raised this question for me in that I almost never hear about those prizes anymore. I hadn't known about Think a Bit. What do we need to do to make this more of a known passion, like a vital habit, if you will, of exposing young people to science, young women to science?
So I think those prizes still are out there, and companies like Intel and Boeing and educational companies do a phenomenal. Microsoft has really good programs as well. Our observation is that in order to have students go into STEM fields, they have to be interested. And that was a problem, and that's why we stress the engagement piece so much, because without students being interested, they don't enter these. So I think there's a lot of wonderful education programs. I like the prizes, but you don't have to be Einstein and you don't have to be Ellen Stofan to have an incredible career in STEM or a STEM-related field. So we are trying to throw a broad swath. To me, Think a Bit Lab kind of hits a very needed niche in terms of hands-on engagement. There's a lot of online education is very interesting and such, but again, how are you going to get these students interested in these programs? They're not going to go for an online, degree, right? If they're not interested. And I'm actually very interested in seeing if some of these engagement techniques that actually work so well for younger people actually work for retraining as well. Because I've heard stories about, retraining workforce. We work with the workforce development groups and some of the retraining seminars where, people are being laid off from, air conditioning and manufacturing companies, and they're just not interested in programming or IT and such. And part of me thinks, maybe they're being approached wrong. I mean, I'm not sure they're going to make projects like this, but I think the engagement piece
I have lots more
is really
questions,
key.
but let me just scan the audience. Any questions for my, right, let's go right here. But I'm not done with you yet. So, yeah. Okay, right here, and then we'll come. Yes, hi.
Good morning. My name is Ola Olude Afolabi. I have a PhD in artificial intelligence. And I want to say thank you so much, Ms. Armstrong, for such a great job. And I want to say thank you to Kalia. I have 3 daughters. And you say you're a 9th grader?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have 3 daughters. I have a 7th, an 8th, and 12 who just went to college. And she did the same thing. She designed a robot that sorts trash. And she got the idea just the same way she went to class. My question to Ms. Armstrong is, do we have this? I know you said they have the engagement issues. Do we have a program that moves into all these middle schools, to increase the STEM education or to increase the engagement of these young girls.
Terrific question.
moving.
Let me hold that just a minute. I'm going to get this gentleman right up here because I originally pointed at you as well. So let's get you both questions and we can handle them together. Good morning.
Good morning. My question is regarding why do we need so much effort to get people into science when people flock to art knowing they're going to be poor, knowing they're, but the passion is there. Why is that? Why is science so hard to sell?
Great question. So can we talk about both about what we can do to kind of broaden STEM and also what we can do more, or why isn't it something that where gravity takes you towards science more naturally?
Right. And so to the former, how can we get more people into STEM and how do these programs feed in, I think was your question. And it's really important in this engagement that you actually work with, there's a place for that interest to go. And so we work with other educational programs, we work with schools, and the teachers, we don't just offer to everybody. We want to have a set of interested administrators and teachers who will take that interest and pull it and take it somewhere. Because I think that's critical. Otherwise, you spark an interest in a week-long class, and then if there's no place to go, then it's like game over. To the other point, why is it hard to get people interested in science and such? I think for me, I entered computer science in the dark ages, and I was going to be a veterinarian. And I think I got engaged because my first programming class was like a puzzle. But I have read statistically robotics has pulled in the last like 20 years, has pulled in accessible robotics and accessible microelectronics have pulled in a tremendous number of girls because it's tangible. You can make interesting things with your hands. But I don't know that I have a silver bullet for how we get more people interested in it. I find the best engineers are very creative people. Often, I do creative things on the side as well, and so that's the other thing I love about Think of It Lab is we call it a STEM program. It's actually a STEAM program,
right?
And it pulls in. I think that's one of the unique aspects of it is that crazy craft wall. We're a big client of Oriental Trading. We never throw away anything. Every kid on the planet likes to cut the head off a plush toy. So I think it's partially the creativity that pulls some of these students in. But it's a really good question, and I think we throw it out to the
I will
audience.
say, because I think it's an interesting question as well, but my decision and our decision to invite Susie and Kalei up here is because whether it's an uncomfortable thing to talk about, and I'm always talking to folks about the micro and the macro. In the micro, I can find a billion moments of great leadership, of students like Kalei, something that was a unique thing. In the macro, we're missing it if we don't understand there's a bias against young women going into engineering. And so if you overcome that by creating systemically exposure opportunities, then in the end you may get something. So both can be simultaneously true. We can have the Kalei cooks, and we can also be failing in overcoming, I think, what have been biases in society. So I think it's slightly different than what you asked, but I do think that, from my own experience, I see it out there. From my traveling, I see it out there. And I also find it weird because the other thing is, globally, if you look at women in engineering around the world, women in engineering around the world outside the United States outnumber men. It's not the case in the United States. So it's something we haven't talked about either. What is going on over there that we're not doing here? So, Kalei, my last quick question to you, because I always like to, give people a chance to speak. If you were going to do one thing to improve Think a Bit, what would it be?
I would probably have schools talk about it more, because I found out about it through school, and if someone that works there goes to our school, talks about it, and then has our class go there, or just have posters or something on schools and stuff. Yeah.
Great. Well, I will make sure that they hear that critique. Right, Susie? Ladies and gentlemen, Kalei Cook and Susie Armstrong, thank you both so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Susie, and a special thanks to Kalei. We look forward to seeing your bright future unfold. And especially for being in 9th grade. Kudos, and thank you again for being here today. Now please welcome Danielle Burr, Head of Federal Affairs with Uber, and Laura Cox-Kaplan, host and creator of She Said podcast. The Hill's Julia Manchester is back with these trailblazing women on stage for conversations about empowering women in the workforce.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Laura and Danielle, for joining us today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. So to just start out with, and I know this is a really general question, it's probably a bit of a deep dive, but Danielle, you work in tech, and Laura, you have a lot of business corporation experience. Why are there so few women in these fields? Very, very deep question, but I'll open it up to the floor with you guys on this.
Sure, great. Happy to start, and thank you, Julie, thank you everybody at the Hill and for the audience for listening to us today. I'm so happy to be a part of this conversation. I think one of the things that we know about why there is a lack of diversity is because of a lack of opportunity. And we think about elevating the conversation and making sure we're having that conversation with all segments of the population will help show that sunlight and let people know that these opportunities exist. At Uber, I like to think about the work that we do in the transportation space as kind of providing people the opportunity, and whether that means coming to work individually at Uber or providing them the opportunity for transportation in a transportation desert to get to whatever that opportunity needs to be for them. But you're right, we could spend a lot of time talking about this and really dive deep into it, but I think that having the conversation is a really great place to start.
Absolutely, and Laura.
Sure. Thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for being here. It's a big topic, and during my time in corporate America and on Capitol Hill, we really worked very hard. PwC, when I was there, I left about 3 years ago, but was on the leading edge of really progressive policies focused on diversity and inclusion, and yet the needle has not moved as much as what we would have liked. So whether it's tech or whether it's other fields, it's moving, it's just moving so slowly. And one of the areas that I have been focused on more recently is on trying to be more thoughtful about maybe elements of the conversation that are still missing. Can we be more authentic about the types of struggles that we have at work? And I don't just mean the big picture, high profile stuff. I mean things like self-doubt and holding ourselves to a really high standard, being super hard on ourselves.
Yes.
I have yet to find a woman that I talk to who's a professional who doesn't have these feelings. And yet it's fairly unusual to talk about those in the workplace. And I don't ever recall having a conversation with a coach or a mentor in which I felt like that person necessarily understood that, or maybe was helping to encourage a conversation along those lines. So I do think there's more work we can do, and I can talk a little bit about the podcast, this is a big theme for me at She Said. But I do think having more authentic conversations is another piece of the puzzle that perhaps we could do a better job on.
Absolutely, and I'd like to really focus in on that part for a second here. With recruitment and getting women, I cover women in politics at the Hill, and one thing I constantly hear is when women run for office or make that decision, they always have to be asked, or most of the time, they have to be asked to run for office. How much does that apply to your respective industries, and how can we make women feel more inclusive in the workforce, whether it's in tech or maybe in a corporation? How do we bring women in and make them feel like they're welcomed and like they don't necessarily have to ask, that they can make these decisions on their own? Either of you.
Yeah. So I think there's a number of facets to that particular question, Julia. It is very complex, right? Part of it deals with confidence. Are we confident raising our hand? Are we focused so much on getting everything just perfect that we can't get to the point of actually hitting the off button and applying? And that can be a real challenge. And you're right, the statistics do show that it takes asking a woman 3 or 4 times whether she's willing to run for office, whereas a man is sort of jumping up and down to do it. I do think that's changing somewhat. I teach at the college level currently, and I do see an uptick in just the self-awareness of young women to know that sometimes we do this to ourselves and that they need to be more self-aware about that. And I think that's a big part of the puzzle. If you know going in that you may be uncomfortable, right? That you may never feel 100% sort of secure and not have a little bit of fear inside your gut when you're volunteering for that big assignment or you're saying you want to run for office or whatever it happens to be, if you understand that the discomfort may just go along with it and you do it anyway, again, having candid conversations about that element, I think are really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Danielle.
absolutely. And I think anecdotally, you always hear the story about the woman who looks at the job description that hears that, 5 years experience are required and she only has 4.5. So she's not going to apply. Whereas the other gender might think at 3 years that they're going to go ahead and apply for the job. But I think you're right. And I think that Laura talking about that uncomfortable feeling and knowing that that's okay. While I'm not a university professor, I'm running my own little sociological experiment at home with my little girls. And I talk to them about that sometimes, right? And it's okay. Everything doesn't have to be perfect at all moments of time. It's okay to push it. It's okay to be told no. But you have to try and you have to make that ask.
To Danielle's point, she's the mother of twins, which I think is important for her.
Thank you.
I'm the mother of both a son and a daughter. And I had an experience somewhat recently that I think underscores this notion of role modeling that you're talking about. My daughter, who's 9, was having real self-doubt about a presentation at school. And because I have such anxiety about public speaking, always have, probably always will, I pulled her aside and I said, Mommy's preparing for this big speech, and I have this weird feeling in my stomach. And she said, Mommy, what's wrong? And I said, well, I think Mommy's actually a little bit nervous, but Mommy's telling herself that that's actually excitement.
Right.
So that Mommy's turning her nerves into excitement because the speech is really important. It's an opportunity for us to get people to give money to this great organization that I'm a part of. And so when the day came to give the speech, I took her with me and then at the last minute pulled her up on stage because I wanted her to know that I was nervous, but that I did it anyway. And if we can learn to role model along those lines, not just showing them that we can do it, but actually talking about the fact that it's hard, I think that's so important.
And the same goes in the workplace.
Yes,
the same
it
goes in
does.
the workplace. And just being able to have those candid conversations through mentorships. I think sometimes when we talk about mentorships, we talk about professional trajectory. And that's an important part of the conversation. But sharing that uncomfortableness, sharing your vulnerabilities sometimes is not something that we're really comfortable doing. So be able to have those conversations, admit to ourselves as well as to others that it's not always easy. And that's okay.
And when should mentorship start? I mean, we talked about how there are some women growing up who don't feel like they can necessarily talk to a coach or a teacher about a particular issue they're facing or a particular direction they want to go in their career, their life, or a particular project they're working on. So when should we start mentoring young girls to really empower them for the future?
We should encourage everybody to recognize that your potential mentors are right in front of you all the time. This perpetual search for the perfect mentor is ridiculous, quite frankly. I mean, it's great if you seek and you find that person, that's great. But chances are, right in front of you are the people who already know you so well, who you should be asking for feedback and getting comfortable with that exercise. I had British Robinson, who's the new CEO of the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy, on the podcast a week ago. And she talks about this notion so eloquently about the fact that we get so tangled up in trying to find that perfect person that the best mentors are the ones that are already in your life. And focusing more on building a relationship that's really a two-way relationship where you're adding value to that person and they're adding value to you is so much more important than the vernacular or semantics.
And that there's more than one. There's somebody that you talk to about this aspect, and there's someone that you talk to about this, and you value somebody else's perspective on another topic, and knowing that it's also evolving, and that it doesn't need to be, on this date until in perpetuity. And so recognizing that it's changing, recognizing your needs and the mentor's needs are all changing, I think is a really important part to incorporate into a relationship like that. But I think we're always mentoring. We're always mentoring girls.
Right. And let's talk about corporate boards and trying to diversify them. My mother works in business and she talks about the movement within the industry to really get more women, more people of color onto these boards. So where do you see this going? Are we headed in more of a positive direction? How much work needs to be done? I'll give it to both of you.
Sure.
Laura's done so much work in this, so
Yeah,
please.
well, probably not enough. But I do sit on two corporate boards, and we were talking before we came on stage that in one of the last recruitment cycles, it took a lot of rounds going back with the firm that we had hired to go back looking for more diverse candidates, and they would continue to present us with a slate, and you would have aspects of diversity, but maybe not checking all the boxes that we really wanted to see in terms of that slate. And if you didn't have board members who were willing to say to the recruiter, you know, this is nice, but let's go one more round. And that means being tolerant of taking the time to actually force the folks working with you to go a little bit deeper, to do another round, and it takes board members who are willing to continue to push that. So that's one piece of it. I also think, too, and I get a lot of people ask me questions about, well, how did you position yourself for corporate board work? And because I came out of PricewaterhouseCoopers, that was a very helpful credential, but that's not the reason why I'm on boards. In both cases, folks had reached out to me, and when I was going through the interview process, I would say to them, what are you looking for? Well, we want someone with investment banking, and we want somebody with real estate experience, and we want somebody, basically every criteria that they listed were not things that I had. And I would say, well, this is an interesting conversation. Here's what I think I could do for your board, and here's the perspective that I think I could bring given what I have been doing. And in both cases, they hired me. But it wasn't because I looked anything like the job description that they had presented to me. So I think those are sort of two different dimensions. It's sort of the action on the part of existing board members to really push for more. And then it's also, as women and diverse candidates, looking at how we can add value and aligning that with the objectives and strategic goals of the company.
Absolutely. And even I think one of the other perspectives that to offer is that it's coming from our customers are demanding it, our employees are demanding it, and so it's a real commitment that companies are making to diversify. And they have to make that commitment, and they have to make it publicly. I'm really proud of the diversity that's represented on our board, but that didn't come easily. That wasn't what truly wasn't organic. That was a commitment that the company made that our board needed to look like our customer base that we operate around the world in. And so having that commitment at the executive leadership level, however you get it, whether it's through the customers, whether it's through advocates, whether it's through your own employees, is really critical. And having that commitment is the only way that we're going to see change.
Right. And I think we definitely touched on some of this when we talked about mentorships, but I think a lot of achieving maybe more equality in the workplace or more equal number of people of different sexes or minorities in the workplace. A lot of it starts actually when you look at early childhood education, going through, to higher education. Talk about how schools and maybe, after school programs, families, how they can make sure their daughters, their sons are able to, achieve what they want to when they enter the workforce.
Sure. I think it has so much to do with providing people the opportunity, provide them the opportunity to see what their life could look like and just give them choices and visibility. So again, things like this, having the conversation is critically important. I by no means am an early childhood expert on what we should be educating our kids on, but I do think that we should be making sure that as we're educating the youth that we are matching it for the workforce that we're going to have and what that requires and what that looks like, and creating spaces where people feel comfortable. But I think exposure to opportunity is really the number one thing that we should be doing, and at least where I can speak from. I'm sure there's a lot of things we could be doing at the early childhood level that it's not my nature, but at the same time, I think that just providing opportunity, providing exposure is really, really important. And there's a lot of great groups out there that do that. And whether it's, corporations that can help support them and fund them, whether it's, getting more women elected to Congress, whether it's teaching more girls how to code, these are all really important endeavors. So finding where you can be impactful in your lane, I think is just a really great way to be able to increase that opportunity and visibility.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. As the mother of both a son and a daughter, I'm very sensitive to the images and messages that both of my children actually hear. We are so focused on girls, which is awesome, but I don't want the balance to tilt so far in one direction that we end up with a problem on the other hand. And, hopefully we are I'm presenting these opportunities in a manner in which both my kids can appreciate and understand that there is great opportunity that's available to both of them, right? And so I think role modeling as parents is so an important component. Like Danielle, I'm not an expert in early childhood education other than my firsthand experience, a lot like her. But I do think that's another really important element of this conversation that we cannot lose. It has to be, but we do have to talk to both genders about how important this is.
Absolutely, and I could talk to you ladies for hours about this, but I wanted to open it up to the audience in case anyone had any questions. We have about 5 minutes left in the panel. I think I see a couple of hands on this side. There we go.
Hello. I think oftentimes women try to find that elusive work-life balance, and maybe the better way that we should be calling it is work-life integration. So from your
prioritization.
From your guys' experiences, how do you build workplaces that allow for that, that allow you to be supportive of the women around next to you and whatnot?
That's a great question. I think about myself, and I don't talk about work-life balance. I have a life. And my life includes my work, it includes my family, it includes my friends, my charity, my churches. And every day that balance may feel a little imbalanced because somebody's getting a little more than somebody else. But at the end of the day, at the end of the week, at the end of the year, I can look back and think that, everybody feels a little balanced. When I think of, so that's how I think of my own life. When I think about the team and the company that I'm in, it's really a supportive environment to allow folks to do whatever those priorities are for them. I have children, so sometimes I want to go and see a ballet performance at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm going to get back online later in the evening. Or somebody else might really feel passionately about a certain yoga teacher and they want to go take that class at noon, and so go do it. I think that we really need to, and technology is so great to allow us to do those things. So the workforce that allows us to be mobile, that allows us to, engage whenever we need to and take time off when we need to, is a real blessing of technology right now. So I try to lead by example in that regard and let folks know that it's okay, whatever your passion is. It's not just about having children or having a spouse that you need to get home for, but it's about whatever it is in life to keep you balanced. And it's never quite perfect. But I don't like to try to think about balance. I think you just have to think about your life and do you feel balanced?
Yeah, that's great, really great perspective. And the notion of transparency, both for senior men and senior women, and setting that example and being very transparent about what it is that they're doing and how they're going about prioritizing, because it is life. And it's a matter of prioritizing. Not everything is going to happen in a given day. I think Danielle really said it very well. But I do think the example piece for both genders is very important.
Absolutely. We have another question. I think there's some on the side of the room.
Excuse me, I'm a little under the weather. Hi, my name is Marilyn. And first of all, let me just say thank you so much for doing this particular segment on women at work. I would like to push back on something you had made a statement about, Daniel, speaking about the lack of diversity is due to the lack of opportunity. And I would push back and maybe ask you to flesh it out a little bit more, because I think it's the lack of political will on the part of company heads making decisions about how they're going to push diversity forward. And I specifically think about intersectionality. So for women of color, there's an additional layer there. For example, California in 2019 only decided to pass this Discrimination Act against women of color in natural hair. It shouldn't have taken this long. I mean, when I started out, I was told I needed to put my dreadlocks in a little bun so that it wouldn't be offensive. And so I'd like to know a little bit more about how we get the political will going around the decision makers in terms of moving that needle forward, rather than just talking about the opportunity, which seems to sort of put the onus on the person seeking the opportunity rather than the folks making that overture.
Thanks for the opportunity to let me clarify that, because I'm not trying to say it's on all of us to make sure that people know that opportunities exist and to provide them with opportunities. And so under no circumstances would I say that it's on someone to seek out those opportunities. I think it's on those that have the opportunity to be able to share it and provide information and transportation or mentoring, whatever it is. And I would go back to the answer that I gave before with regards to all of the different places where companies can feel pressure. And I think that for us, and different places that I've seen in my life, the employees, the customer base, that's where it changes. And I think that that's really how we can be most impactful. I think there's a lot of good leaders in business who inherently know this. And I think that you can make a very strong business case as to why you need to have a diverse workforce. And a lot of people are doing that. But engaging with an employee base, engaging with a customer base to encourage that, I think is the real way to shift that to some extent. Thanks.
We have time for one more question if anyone has one. One over here?
Do you still have a question? Did you change your mind?
Sorry. Hi.
Oh, okay.
Hi. Again, I want to say thank you. Really great remarks. My question is sort of a follow-up to the previous one, and that is around, we've got mentorship, we talked about the commitment from leadership, but have you experienced or seen some successful sponsorships for women, and especially women of color that have participated and even achieved or accomplished and moved up because of those sponsorships?
I have to think about that. Do you have any good example?
Well,
off the top of your...
I do at a very personal level. I mean, we, again, citing back to my corporate life, which I left 3 years ago, but it was a matter of making very conscious choices about mentorship and sponsorship in order to move the diversity needle and really making conscious choices around that. So when I was in the process of leaving my role, I helped to handpick my successor, who happens to be a diverse female, which I'm very, very proud of. She was more than deserving of the role, but I also pushed to make sure that I was doing everything I could to help support her candidacy. That's just a simple one-off. But I think taking that initiative, each of us as individuals have a role to play. We can't just rely on the corporation or the organization or whatever it is. We have to take the responsibility of saying, I'm going to help this person and here's how we're going to do it. And taking that person to meetings and advocating on their behalf and saying this is the person that we think needs to have that job. But it's taking the responsibility as an individual as opposed to this notion that it is about the broader organization. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's my perspective.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't think I can point to any one specific organization or things like that. I think it's a universal conversation to have.
Right. Well, thank you so much, ladies. This was really wonderful.
Thank
you so much for
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Thank you, Danielle, Laura, and Julia. Now we are going to move to a conversation on LGBTQ+ inclusion and efforts to attain a more equal society for the gay and transgender community. Please join me in welcoming on stage Brian Bond, Executive Director of PFLAG, and Casey Pick, Senior Fellow for Advocacy and Government Affairs with the Trevor Project. Steve Clemens is back once more to moderate this conversation.
Time. Been 4 times. You've been a great audience so far, and there's another great segment here. I just want to say thank you for. I feel like we ought to give medals out to people who make it to the very end of one of our summits. I promise you, before I leave this job, we will go to medals for finishing our own version of policy marathons. Thank you both for being here, Casey and Brian. And we've been talking about just so many different tracks about diversity, inclusion, how to make it matter. I want to say just a word. You're both heroes to me. Brian is someone I've known for a long time. Used to work in the White House with Valerie Jarrett. He was the interface with the community on many, many different issues, but particularly LGBTQ issues. And at that time, Brian, had he not been there, we would not have gotten Don't Ask, Don't Tell repealed, in my view. So I just want to say thank you for that. I was writing a lot, sometimes critically, about that White House and the stance that it had, and Brian moved that ball forward. So thank you very much. And I just want to start with you, Brian, for a minute. Now you're at PFLAG. You've worked in various corners of this community and the area of rights. And I hate the word tolerance. I don't hate the word tolerance, but it's more than tolerance. It's acceptance. It's embrace. It's working together. And I just want to know from you, in since Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal, what year was that?
That was 2010.
So when you were thinking about what you were creating then in 2010 and where we are today, are you disappointed with where we're at this moment? Have we moved as far as you thought we would by 2019, or should we be substantially disappointed that we haven't achieved more?
First of all, thank you for having us here. Hi, everybody. How are you doing? Brian Bond. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I do need to go back to your original statement. Thank you, but I do give all credit to President Obama and his leadership for getting Don't Ask, Don't Tell done. And an incredible group of people, both at the DOD and the White House, who worked on that. I think one of the things that, to mention President Obama, around his leadership on not just Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but hate crimes and multiple areas within the various agencies. I see Phil is here. He knows a lot of work that went on in his agency and others. The president looked at it as a long game, and by enacting Don't Ask, Don't Tell, enacting it into law, not by executive order. We've seen what can happen with some executive orders. He saw this as and I don't want to speak for him, but as a path towards equality. It's a little hard to ask individuals to fight and die for this country and not acknowledge their spouses and their partners. So there's a long game. I felt like the president constantly looked at things from a long game perspective. To your point, I think we have come a long way. I think there has been what I would call a backlash, if you will. Not surprising, as candidly, there's a lot of people who don't agree with us, and we're seeing that play out. There's a lot of hate right now that's being spouted out that is having an impact, and Casey will be able to speak to that, on the impact that's having on kids and on families. I think just for those of you who don't know what PFLAG is, PFLAG is the oldest and largest LGBTQ+ individuals, parents, family, and friends organization around the country. Our primary goal is to support families as they go through their journey of helping their kids come out. And it's been around for 47 years. There are 400 chapters around the country, about 200,000 members. And I think we'll touch on this a little later, but one of our other programs that we do is around building allies through our Straight for Equality program in the corporate space, which is really crucial. So I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, it does. It does. So let me, Casey, ask you the same thing. And I know that in addition to the Trevor Project, and thank you for all you do in that area, I was thinking of you this morning when I was interviewing Malik Pancholi, because Malik sort of tells the story of a young 12-year-old. It's a novel, but a lot of it is related to his own life of coming out, the bullying, the identity challenges, the issues, and the stress of those times. So Trevor has been for those of you who don't know, and I'll give Casey a chance to share what that is all about. But you've worked in the terrain as well. And can I ask you, should we be disappointed about where we're at right now, or should we, as a collective LGBTQ and plus community friends, feel proud of where we are right now?
I would say the answer to that question is a little bit of both, unsurprisingly. So the Trevor Project is our nation's largest provider of suicide prevention and crisis intervention services for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning youth. In the last year, we've served 80,000 youth who have contacted us through our 24/7 telephone, lifeline, chat, and text services, where they can come to us in moments of crisis and have somebody hear them and listen to them who understands and can tell them that they are loved just as they are and should be accepted just as they are. You're right, my career does go back in my days prior to the Trevor Project to working on Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal from outside the White House, shall we say. And
thank you for that.
Thank you. But yes, so the work then was always to create a world where those who want to serve, are capable of serving, should be able to serve, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, and this is important. So we can be proud of how far we've come in terms of open service for lesbian, gay, and bisexual service members, and where we went from folks doing so much fear-mongering of what that was going to mean when our military allowed for open service, and our military really rose to the occasion in terms of demonstrating that if you are qualified and capable, you can serve. And we even, over the course of the years since that repeal, we were able to expand that to allowing for open service by transgender folks in their gender identity. We had that for a time, and then, as folks know, we lost it, in part. But we lost it in a way that is particularly traumatic for LGBTQ youth. On the day when the president released his tweets declaring that there was no place in our military for transgender individuals, suggesting that transgender individuals are a burden, the Trevor Project heard from a spike in youth contacting us. And this is because of many reasons. When the leader of the free world calls you out and says that you are in some way a burden, that is harmful to mental health and self-esteem. When an avenue to achievement and to, in many cases, a new life, the United States military, which is one of our largest employers, when that avenue is closed to you, that is closing down one form of hope. And so it is tremendously important that we continue to work to reopen that avenue for all folks who are qualified to want to serve, because it doesn't just affect people who want to serve in the military or who are serving. It sends a message to every transgender youth in this country about the extent to which we value you and the extent to which we believe in your capability. And we should believe in the strength and resilience of these youth in particular. We hear from them so often on the Trevor Project, and I am always amazed at the strength of our LGBTQ youth.
Casey, thank you for that. And I want to ask you just another question on this. When John McCain was around, I had the privilege of interviewing Senator McCain dozens of times, actually, and often on this subject. And while he had been one of those who had resisted at the moment Don't Ask, Don't Tell, once Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, John McCain became one of its most important enforcers, that we don't go back, we don't regress. And I think became a friend and ally of those serving, and including transgendered issues. And so I guess my question to you, he's not around anymore. Do you have Republican support for your efforts to restore those rights?
These are issues that are bipartisan, and I will call out that on the day of Trump's tweets condemning transgender service, there were many Republicans that pushed back on that said that went too far. John McCain was one, Senator Joni Ernst was another, and it went on down with many Republicans saying that if people want to serve and are capable of serving up to standards, they should be able to serve. So that is one of those areas. Similarly, there had been amendments and churn in the House where there would be a proposal to refuse to spend money on transgender health care for our military service members. And that amendment was defeated on the floor with the support of 30-40 House members, Republican House members. So this is one of those issues where when we're talking about our men, women, non-binary individuals in uniform, that there is respect for what they do. That respect, unfortunately, may not rise all the way to the White House today, but that will change.
Brian?
I just want to add a couple things. This is not just happening at DOD. This is happening across the administration, and especially the attacks on transgender individuals is pretty heinous and hateful, honestly. You can look at what HHS is trying to do around the Affordable Care Act and healthcare-related issues. I mean, the list goes on. Separate from the government component, to your original question on kind of the climate, if you will, and where we are today, we have seen advances, and I know it's a cliche thing, but there's still 17 states where you can get married on Sunday and then get fired on Monday, right? I mean, but it's true. We have what's going on with the Supreme Court right now around sexual orientation and gender identity, Title VII related issues. Which some of that is out of our control, right? It's the Supreme Court. But we have an important responsibility as a community to lead the narrative of what all that means. And then,
I want to ask you to go back to that.
Okay. The one last piece around the cultural side of this, we just had our convention in Kansas City this last weekend. Casey was there. When we were originally putting together one of the pages we were going to do in our program book, it was around the number of transgender people of color, mostly black women, who have been killed. And that number was at 24 when we started to go to print. on October 14th, I think it was, the 25th person was killed, a black transgender woman in Kansas City, 30 years old. Her name was Breonna Bibi Hill. And we had to add her to that list. That's how fast some of this stuff is moving. It's egregious, it's wrong. And I said this at our convention, and I'm not trying to be dramatic about it, but if that were 25 gay, straight, white men like me, the world would be going crazy to solve that problem. And what I found and felt out of our convention, which is made up of a lot of moms and dads and allies and friends, that rage was there. And now what are we going to do about it? But that's one of the side effects. I can't quantitate, or I can't tell you it's exactly because of the hate rhetoric that's going on now, because last year was also really bad. But we need to be talking more about the systemic hate that's there. And I don't care what these individuals do, what's going on in their lives. They're human beings. And we need to, as a community and as a world, care about these individuals as such.
I appreciate that. Let me ask you about this. You know, I finally watched, I'm sure many of you were way there before I was, but the two movies. There's one documentary and the other is the movie on RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And so this law, that 1964 law that there would not be discrimination of employees based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Now we're debating that who is covered in that sex quadrant, and that had given at least some hope and refuge. You just mentioned this, Brian, and I'm just interested in how fragile is the situation? How fragile are our rights, are those of us that are in the LGBTQ camp? How fragile are all of our rights in these upcoming Supreme Court decisions?
So I will defer to Casey, who's a lawyer, probably better to answer that than me. What I would say is we are at a fragile moment, to use your frame on this. I do think around the SCOTUS cases right now, we have to use voices to be part of the narrative, to learn from all of this and what's going on, regardless of the outcome. And Casey can, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but you can speak to that. But we also need to enact the Equality Act. Over 30 states, this is something we need to do to codify into law around housing, job discrimination, accessibility, public places, all that. But so that's the long-term solution. It's going to take a while, thanks to the leadership of Speaker Pelosi and many on the Hill, that it's done on the House side.
And Ben Ray Lujan said it was a huge priority this morning. Yeah,
cool. And now we're kind of beholden to Mitch McConnell to try to move it to the Senate side, which means there may need to be some changes in the Senate to actually have that discussion, and then obviously a president who will sign that. So, but again, I would say all this discussion around the Supreme Court and the work that's going on in the various states, all this is about lifting up voices, which is part of what PFLAG tries to do, is to make sure people know they're not alone. We're all in this journey together, and to amplify those voices. But I'll defer to Casey to talk a little more about that.
Certainly. And on the issue of the Title VII lawsuits, this was actually one of those places where Trevor Project was so proud to partner with PFLAG, in that together our organizations plus the Family Equality Council actually filed an amicus brief raising up the kinds of stories of the discrimination and the harm that we all hear about, and making specifically the argument that the kind of discrimination that people experience because of their sexual orientation or gender identity really does all boil down to being discrimination about sex. This is discrimination that is intensely gendered, and we all know what that's like. So that's the argument that we were really facing before the Supreme Court this year, is does the word sex include discrimination where a woman is fired for marrying a woman where a man would not be similarly fired? Does discrimination based on sex include discrimination against a transgender woman as opposed to a cisgender man? And we obviously believe that that is so, and we're not alone in that. There has been decades of work on this in the courts, with actual rulings in various different circuit courts of appeal coming down on our side. So while in terms of the words in the law books in states, we do still have 30 states that need to be writing down the words sexual orientation and gender identity. But if we were to lose those protections at the Supreme Court, if the Supreme Court were to narrowly read sex to exclude LGBTQ people, that would be rolling back rights. So we're in a place of really trying to raise that up, raise those stories. And it is a situation where, having listened to the arguments, yes, there was some interest out of Justice Gorsuch in reading from a very textualist basis. Well, the word says sex there, and this looks a lot like sex discrimination. But on the other side of it, I really came away from the arguments recognizing that we still have a lot of education work to do. Mm-hmm. That even these brilliant justices from across the spectrum of who nominated them have some work yet to do in terms of understanding, especially our transgender siblings, and what their life experience is like. And so yes, we will, no matter what the outcome of this decision is, there was still education work to do. And it is also important to know that on the federal level, the word sex appears in legal protections for employment, for housing, but it does not appear for public accommodations. It does not appear for federal funding. So there are places where even with an expansive definition of sex, or rather appropriately inclusive definition, there's work to be done in passing comprehensive LGBT protections on the federal level and in the states.
I want to go to all of you in just a minute, but my last question is recently I met Rick Grinnell. Ambassador Rick Grinnell is a U.S. ambassador to Germany, and he was at the UN General Assembly, and he spent a lot of time talking about the efforts that President Trump is making and he is making to raise the question of decriminalizing homosexuality, decriminalizing the penalties against LGBTQ youth. Do you think they're not getting enough credit for that work? And is that work that they're trying to do internationally by way of law somehow not connecting to what they're doing here in the United States?
It is, I appreciate any public statement that speaks to the plight of LGBT people abroad, especially now when we are seeing a resurrection of legislation in, say, Uganda that proposes to apply the death penalty to homosexuality. That said, I was just recently in a meeting with the Department of Housing and Urban Development about a proposed rule that would allow for discrimination by homeless shelters against transgender people. And so when your rules and your policies at home are resulting in harm and potentially deaths to the LGBTQ community, I do see a certain irony that from an administration that has spoken about America first, that it is leaving America's LGBTQ population last in its calculus.
Thank you, Brian.
I'm trying to be really nice here.
You don't have to be.
No, I mean,
yeah,
at the end of the day,
no need to be nice.
At the end of the day, proof is in the pudding.
I was the nice one.
Proof is in the pudding. You know,
Yeah.
and to Casey's point, yeah, I'm glad the ambassador is talking these things, but you have to walk the walk too, and that's not what's happening here. And especially in places, countries like Uganda and others, where there are conversations going on, we may have certain diplomats that come in and have quiet conversations about X, Y, and Z, but it depends on what's coming from the top. And they read everything that this president says and that his administration is doing, and they know they're going to get a pass at the end of the day if they don't. And it's sad because it impacts lives, life and death in many cases.
Well, thank you for answering. I needed to pose a question to, like, we have this gentleman right here. Hey, how are you?
I'm well. Thank you. Thank you to the Hill for doing this great forum this morning. Brian, we've been longtime friends. I would happily be in the trenches with you any day of the week.
Remind the folks who you are.
Phil McNamara with the Pew Charitable Trust. My question is, and I'm picking up on a point Casey made regarding sort of the education regarding our transgender brothers and sisters. And I know it's not the sort of focus of either of your organizations, but would you have maybe a recommendation that you could share with an employer as to how to sort of improve the sort of the working conditions for a transgender individual, non-binary? You know, is it as simple as unisex bathrooms? Is it as simple as using, as you did, Brian, the he, him, his pronouns? What are those things that employers could be doing, you know, today to improve the conditions?
Terrific, thank you.
Sure. In terms of folks to look to, immediately comes to mind is Out and Equal, is an organization that is made up largely of organizing the employee resource groups at different companies and corporations. So they've got decades of experience on how to go about this. Also, very much it's a matter of talk to your trans employees. What do they want? What do they need? And actually listen to that and bring, this is a question for any diversity issue of whenever you're trying to set policies, have the folks who are most affected by those policies at the table writing them. Let them write the first draft. So it's one of those things. But really it all boils down to treating each other decently, with respect, and how folks want to be treated.
Brian, any quick thoughts?
Sure. I would add to Out and Equal, I would also add NCTE. Mark Kiesling does an incredible job, and I believe is building out a program around this space to be supportive. Just a couple of quick stats, and this is LGBTQ wide, but we do a lot of workplace cultural training through our Straight for Equality program. 80% of individuals that have been surveyed in the corporate space, you know, think that employees should be out. But then that same group, when you ask them, a little over 50%, 59% actually say, well, it's unprofessional for them to talk about their sexual orientation or gender identity. and then they get, and then a 30-some% get really squeamish if you talk about who you may be on a date with. So there's a lot of work there. You know, I talked earlier about passing the Equality Act. Moving the dial forward in the corporate space around the allies and building allies is really crucial. And I'll just real quick, if I could, we all talk about diversity. Diversity is just numbers. You need to go that extra layer to inclusion and having people at the table. But then you need to go further, and this, to your point about asking trans employees what they want, is belonging. And belonging is when people are charged and then responsible and able to actually help make that change happen in that corporate or whatever other space it is. That's the model we work from in our ally training. But you know, that was a really good question, Phil. So thank you.
Well, I just want to say thank you to you both, Brian Bond of PFLAG and Casey Pick of the Trevor Project. Thank you so much. I know Brian in particular, you went through hell to get here, to be here today, so thank you so much for joining us. Big round of applause.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Casey.
Thank you all for a great conversation. Your work is truly inspiring. Last but certainly not least, please join me in welcoming on stage Tiffany Cross, co-founder and managing editor of The Beat DC, for a conversation about diversity in Washington, from the halls of Congress to the lobbying corridors of K Street. Raphael Bernal is back to lead this conversation.
All right.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to scoot closer to you, Raphael.
All right, I won't complain. So, you're the founder of the Beat DC.
Yes.
By the way, round of applause for that, because if you don't read it, you should be reading that.
Thank you.
You seem to know a lot about a lot of people.
Yes. 20 years in DC.
That helps. Who do you want to be reading it?
Everybody. So let me say, we started The Beat in 2016 during the DNC. I had one original investor, somebody who was willing to put money on the table. It was Robert Rabin, who I call him the David Geffen of the Beltway. But he runs a progressive public affairs firm here in DC. And I had tried to do this several times. I was with BET News. I ran the bureau there and just wanted to create something because, you know, we read the morning political rags every day. And something I noticed is we were all talking about, you know, we'd read Politico and Axios, and then we talk about what was in these...
there's another one.
Yes.
Sorry.
But I'm throwing shade, so I'm saying the ones I want.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, those guys.
But yeah, exactly, those guys. But we would talk about what was in the morning newsletters, and then we'd have whole other conversations about what wasn't in the morning newsletters. And so you know that those can be springboards and launching pads for people, and if you're reading something where you're not reflected, you feel invisible, and it also sends a message to other people that you might be invisible. Particularly, even in the spotted section, you know, there would be a reception the night before, and, you know, this press secretary from some member of Congress you haven't heard of was spotted, and I'd read it like, damn, you had a black chief of staff there, and you know, from a well-known member, and we didn't spot that person. So it wasn't intentional, I discovered. It was because you spot who you know, and so that just happened to be who people knew. And so we grew. I initially wanted to create something for us in the Beltway, and it wasn't for people of color, it was about people of color. Everybody should read it the same way that we read things every single day where we're not reflected, but we're certainly affected. Everybody should know what's happening with the rising majority of America. And so we expanded really quickly. I told you before that I thought it was going to be like 300 people reading it every morning. And then within a few months, we were getting emails from Arizona and California and New York and New Hampshire. So it actually grew a lot faster than I was prepared for because I had a really small team. So in August, it breaks my heart to say, but we had to press pause and take a break because I started getting all these other projects and funding. And so we just had to take time to build and work on a project that's very near to me that we'll talk about later. But my shameless plug is I'm writing a book that will come out in July 2020. And so I just had to take a minute to focus on that and build a team and hire and et cetera. So we shall be back.
We'll talk about that book in a second. And have you seen? You were talking about like you spot who you know, and people write about who they know. And have you seen results on that end? Like, have you seen while you have the beat, like, you know, black chiefs get more?
Yes. So the one thing that makes me just delight is. People on the Hill will always come up to me and say, you make me feel like I'm seen and like I'm heard. And that means the world to me. When I speak across the country, people will come up to me and say, honestly, I don't understand anything that's happening on Capitol Hill. I'm ashamed to say I don't read papers, but I read the beat and you make it something I can understand because we really do try to make things digestible. So yeah, I mean, we definitely disrupted the political space, but more importantly, we made what happens in the Beltway more consumable for people who may be intimidated by what's happening here. And it's so much. I mean, I've said before, covering this administration is like trying to catch confetti because there's, you know, a scandal every single day. And we don't focus all of our time on this White House. You know, I mean, we leave that to other people. Right. And sadly, it creates this impression because in the echo chambers that are cable news, it is a perpetual, ubiquitous breaking news sign all the time that deals with something with this White House. And so it creates this false perception that the Caucus isn't doing anything, that the Hispanic, AAPI, and Black caucuses, and the Native American caucus now, that what are they doing? That's the number one question I get when I do different call-in radio shows. And I always have to beat back that perception. It's just not true. It just sadly doesn't get covered.
They are pretty busy caucuses.
That's right.
And the I guess the rosy side of things is these are issues that are being covered to an extent. But the not so rosy side of issues is the diversity on Capitol Hill itself and in the people who cover Capitol Hill itself. Have you seen major advances in that area?
I have, in terms of representation for actual members. I think in 2018 there were over 100 Democratic women elected to Congress. 42, I believe, were people of color, and I think 4 were LGBTQ, members of the LGBTQ community. So I think, with this younger, more woke, if you will, electorate coming in, I think they prioritize that their staff should look like the constituents they serve. That was not always the case. And so, look, that's not to say that there's no room for growth. I mean, look, we have to keep challenging people to do that, and it can't just be the newer members coming in. I mean, we have to hold our elected officials accountable. And really, the thing is, when you're working on Capitol Hill, you're dealing with a lot of things that impact not only your constituents, but even things that don't necessarily directly impact your constituents. Why wouldn't you want your staff to reflect America? Why wouldn't you want the ethnic diversity that brings diversity of thought to your team? And the amount of times where over the years that I've been here that people will call me to ask an off-the-record question, that's always kind of the same understanding, like, Tiffany, explain Black people to us, off the record. And it's like, you could hire somebody on your team where you can have these types of conversations. And I'm always happy to help and have those conversations, but my pushback is always put someone on your team. And I think at least there's an awareness that a lack of diversity is detrimental to your office. But that's not to say that we've achieved the goal of where we want to be, specifically since in 2018, for the first time in this country, in this democracy that was built on stolen land, we just elected for the first time 2 Native American members to Congress. I feel like that's a voice that gets overlooked way too much. Not only are they an important voice to have on Capitol Hill, but if you look at and break down the data across the country, there are electoral pockets where the Native American vote decides races. But you would not know that looking at mainstream media outlets.
You wouldn't, and there's not a lack of talent, but there seems to be a lack of channels for that talent to make it to the Hill or to media, for that matter.
Yeah.
Young reporters of color, the young staff or young wannabe staffers of color. I don't think anybody's born with with the urge to be a staffer.
Yeah.
But some people discover that later in life. It seems like getting there is a bit too expensive.
Yeah, I don't know if expensive is only part of the problem. So I think when you look at the pipeline, the one thing that really irritates me, and I try to respond with compassion, but my patience is wearing a bit thin for the people who say, well, we want to hire diverse candidates, but we don't know where to find any. It's like, man, really? Like, you could almost Google this, I just don't understand that. And you're an elected member of Congress, so what else don't you know? So I think we have to start pushing that back and making sure that these pipelines are actually cleared of hurdles, and putting people in front of these members, putting resumes in front of these members. And so the D-Trip, I will say the DCCC, they certainly made an effort. When Ben Ray left, when Congressman Ben Ray Lujan left, and there was a leadership transition, there was certainly, I know, a lot of people who were having conversations about how can we hire diverse people on this team, and we're happy to share what you all share with us, with members of Congress, to make sure that their teams are diverse. But there are also some kind of way privileged people with money find their way to the Hill. There's no shortage of that. And I think it doesn't take that much more of an effort to find people who, aren't your colleague's daughter, or, went to private school with your college roommate, or whatever, And I think that still continues to be a challenge. The Post did a great piece a few years ago, and they were talking about some of the interns on Capitol Hill wearing designer shoes and carrying designer handbags. I mean, things that I didn't even know about when I was in my teens and 20s. But I certainly remember working alongside people who could do that, and people, getting these great, cute little apartments on Capitol Hill. I mean, you're looking at tens of thousands of dollars to intern on the Hill. And then when you take the economic divide in this country and consider how many people of color can afford to come and do that, in which a lot of times these internships do lead to staff placements in offices. These are challenges. And so I think the Pay Our Interns program that's been really successful on Capitol Hill highlighted this issue. Carlos, I forget his name.
Vera.
Yes,
Yeah,
Carlos Vera.
he's awesome. Yeah.
Thank you. Carlos really championed this issue. And then when you had this new class of members of Congress come in, and they all made a commitment to pay their interns, and then they started reporting out who had agreed. And then the budget committee actually set aside funds for Capitol Hill interns. So I think that's one step. But again, these are all, just like the First Step Act, these are first steps. That doesn't mean there doesn't need to be a second and third step to follow.
We're going to have time for like maybe one audience question. Does anybody have one ready? Oh, well, they're right there.
One thing that is helpful is to hear members of Congress who are people of color, both in the CBC, KPAC, and CHC, ask the companies that come to lobby them, where is your blank person? Where is your African American person? Where is your Latino person? Where is your Native American person? Because unless and until members of Congress are actually putting companies and nonprofits and lobbying firms on the spot, it's not going to change. So I know personally of two powerful Black and African American and Latino members who do this, and it's very, very helpful for all people of color who are trying to break in.
You were talking about that backstage. Is that a recent development?
No. So for years, as I'm sure you know, there are members who will ask, well, how many African Americans are on your board of directors? How many people of color are in your C-suite? And I think those are perfectly fine questions to ask. I think they should be asked. It really bothers me when you hear some people who, will criticize this and, talk about, identity politics and, this shouldn't, take place in our society, as if, the poor working white class wasn't identity politics in its own way. So we have to make sure that we are unapologetic in showing up in this space and representing who we are, because it's not just about the opportunity for the individual. It's, when you're in the room, it's not just you in that room. It is you in that room. And I think, there are some people who are unapologetic in that space. And we have to keep pursuing that issue. And I'd say bravo to those members of Congress for asking. I have been in some of those meetings, and the shame and embarrassment that's on people's faces when they don't have an answer, I hope turns into action where you do consider it. And I'll just say, I'm sure there are a lot of people in this room, when you are at a table, when you show up in that space and you're working on your portfolio, it doesn't mean that you just have to work on the Latino portfolio or the AAPI portfolio or the Black portfolio. You are capable of doing a lot of things. And still, there is a constant pressure to justify your presence there. And that is exhausting. And it also narrows the pipeline, because nobody ever shows up in a room and asks, what are all these ordinary white people doing here? But you can be an Ivy League graduate and have to justify your presence at a table, and we've got to disrupt that way of thinking. So I love when I hear stories that members of Congress are still pressing that issue.
One last quick one. We haven't picked on the media enough.
Do we have time? I'm happy to talk about that.
We don't. But why don't we see more reporters of color? I mean, that's a hell of a question for me to ask with us two sitting here, right? But what happened there?
Yeah, so I think in media, let me say I've worked in some capacity of media for 20 years. This is where y'all supposed to gas. No way, you've been working for 20 years. I have. Yes, for 20 years. And I will say that in my experience, I worked at CNN, I ran the BET Bureau, I worked at Discovery, different places where I've worked. When I've worked for places that were not minority-owned companies, the decision makers do not look like me consistently. 20 years later, I've gone from the control room to the green room. The decision makers still do not look like me. And I think a part of that, what that creates for people is you feel unwelcome. When I first moved here, I was working for CNN, and I was a associate producer on the show Capital Gang. I don't know if people remember that, but I worked for the Prince of Darkness, Bob Novak. He lived up to his name, God rest his soul. And it was an interesting time, but I remember Al Hunt was one of the correspondents on the show, one of the panelists, and we were all going through a meeting, and President Bill Clinton was being honored. He was being inducted into this Hall of Fame with a singer. And so Al Hunt, we're all at this meeting, and it's about 10 of us around the table, and everyone's like, who is this singer Bill Clinton's being inducted with? This is ridiculous. Nobody ever heard of this guy. And they were all laughing and laughing. And I sat there and I didn't say anything because I didn't feel comfortable to say anything. And they turned to me and say, Tiffany, you ever hear of this singer, Al Green? I just said, never heard of him, and left the room because I was so annoyed. It just felt so isolating, all the time. And that's just one example of many. So I think, again, the cable news outlets a lot of older white viewers watch cable news. That's true, probably more than any other demo. I think the decision makers in the news media have not been forward thinking enough and paused long enough to ask what comes next. Because the audience that you are appealing to is a shrinking one. The audience you are ignoring is a growing one. So when it comes to cord cutting time, we'll have to see how well they survive. And I say this as a cable news commentator, so.
I think, well, we're out of time.
I know, I see that wrap up. I was trying to ignore it.
That is, I wish we could, because we could do this. Thank you so much, Tiffany.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Everyone. Another round of applause for, please, and all of our panelists. I think it's evident these conversations could go on for days, but unfortunately, this brings us to the end of the Diversity Matters Summit here at the Hill. Thank you all for being here today, and for our speakers for sharing their expertise. Because of the work that they do and you all do, it's clear that diversity is a strength, and it in fact does matter. A big thanks to our underwriter this morning, Vanda Pharmaceuticals, excuse me. We encourage you to keep the conversation going on social by tagging us at The Hill Events and using the hashtag #TheHillDiversityMatters. On behalf of everyone at The Hill, we would like to thank you all again in the room, and for those who tuned in live to the live stream. If you've missed any portion of today's discussion, the Hill's event video will be on thehill.com shortly. And as a reminder, please be sure to complete the electronic survey that you all will be receiving in your email later today. And enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks again.